The wind comes down off the Manzano peaks, like something that has been waiting all summer to finally say something mean. 412 souls, one main street, one church that doubles as a courthouse, and one bank whose owner stands at his second-floor window every morning at 9, looking east at the mountains with the face of a hunting animal that has spotted something. In the lane behind the storefronts, a woman is walking home. 3 men stop her, 2 from the front, one closing the way back, which means it was arranged. A folded paper comes out of a coat. A very polite invitation. $200, cash money, and free passage north. She does not step back. She does not run. 7 years in this town, and not one soul ever bothered to look at her. Tonight, every one of them is looking. Then the door at the back of the saloon swings open, and the light falls into the lane. Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, October 1878. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps unless someone needs to mark a grave. Population, 412 souls, give or take the ones who stopped counting themselves among the living. One main street, one church that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge bothered to show up, which was twice a year if the weather held, and once a year if it didn't. One saloon, one general store, one bank, and the man who owned the bank owned most everything else worth owning within 30 miles in any direction. The mountains to the east were called the Manzanos. Old Spanish word. It meant apple trees. Nobody could explain why. There hadn't been apple trees up there in living memory. Just rock and juniper and wind that came down off the peaks in October, like something that had been waiting all summer to finally say something mean. The town sat at the foot of those mountains, the way a dog sits at the foot of a door it knows will never open for it, waiting, not knowing why it was waiting, just waiting because that was what it had always done. She was up before the sun, always, not because she liked mornings, not because she had some poetic relationship with the hour before dawn, the way some people claim they do. No, she was up before the sun because the sun brought people. And people meant eyes, and eyes meant the particular exhaustion that came from being looked at the wrong way, before you'd had time to build your armor for the day. Her name was Wren Birdthorne, 25 years old, 5 feet and 2 inches of something the town of Harlan's Crossing had collectively decided not to see. She moved through her morning the way water moves through a crack in stone, quietly, finding the path of least resistance. Not because she was weak, because she had learned very early, very thoroughly, that making noise cost more than it was worth. The single room she rented behind Callaway's Dry Goods was barely large enough for a cot, a washstand, and the wooden chest at the foot of the bed that held everything she owned in the world. She dressed in the dark. Cotton work dress faded from too many washings, the color somewhere between brown and apology. Her hair black, straight, thick, she pinned up without a mirror. She'd stopped needing a mirror years ago. Mirrors asked questions she didn't have time for. The chest at the foot of the bed had a lock. She checked it every morning, not because she was afraid someone would break in. She didn't own anything worth stealing. She checked it because it was the one thing that was hers, completely, irrevocably. The lock was the only door in her life that she controlled. She checked it. It held. She went to work. The work was laundry, and sewing, and mending, and the category of labor that wealthy women in Harlan's Crossing called simple tasks, and that Wren called what keeps me alive. She served 3 households before 7 in the morning. The Abbotts on Crest Street, who had 4 children, and a husband who rode out before dawn, and a wife who had never once said thank you, but always noticed when the collars weren't starched to her exact specification. The widow Drummond, who was kind in the distracted way of someone whose kindness came from not paying attention rather than from actual warmth. And the rectory, where Father Ignacio left clean laundry outside his door in a basket every Monday and never spoke to her directly, which she had long since decided was better than the alternative. She worked. She kept her head down. She did not meet eyes. This was not weakness. This was architecture. She had built herself, room by room, wall by wall, into something that occupied the minimum possible footprint in other people's awareness. A woman who takes up no space is a woman who gives no one a reason. That was the logic. That was the system. It had kept her alive for 7 years in this town. 7 years of being the girl no one saw. 7 years of being the girl who, when she walked into the general store, made conversation stop for exactly 3 seconds, and then resume as if she were furniture. 7 years of being half of something and whole of nothing, which is a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't have a name in English. Though her mother's people had words for it that Rin had stopped letting herself think about, because those words opened doors she couldn't afford to have open. 7 years. And she had gotten very, very good at it. The thing about being invisible is that you see everything. She knew, for example, that Bennett Shear, who worked the front desk at Pritchard's Bank and had a wife and 3 daughters on Maple Lane, visited the brothel on Cutter Street every Thursday evening with the regularity of a man keeping a business appointment. She knew that Deputy Toll kept a bottle of rye in the left drawer of his desk and started on it around 2 in the afternoon. She knew that Aldous Pritchard, who ran the bank and the town council and the unofficial machinery of every significant decision made within 30 miles, had a habit of standing at the window of his second-floor office every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, looking east toward the Manzano Mountains, and that when he did it, his face did something it never did in public. It went quiet, not peaceful, not still. Quiet the way a hunting animal goes quiet when it has spotted something. She had noticed that. She had filed it away. She had not known what to do with it. Not yet. That was October in Harlan's Crossing. The wind coming down hard off the Manzanos. Aldous Pritchard standing at his window, and Wren Birdthorne moving through the town like smoke. Present and not present. There and not there. Her mother had been Mescalero Apache. Her father had been Irish Patrick Birdthorne, out of County Clare by way of Kansas City, by way of a decade of bad decisions that somehow ended in New Mexico territory, with a government job and a woman who looked at him like he was worth looking at, which he had never experienced before and did not know what to do with. And so he had done the only sensible thing, which was to stay. He had worked for the Federal Land Bureau out of Las Cruces, a bureaucrat, a paperman, a man who spent his days certifying titles and recording deeds and doing the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure the documents matched the land and the land matched the documents, and the whole creaking system of territorial law held together with enough integrity to justify its own existence. He had been, by all accounts, an honest man. In New Mexico territory, in 1878, honest men were a specific kind of endangered species. He had died in 1874. Wren had been 18 years old. The official account said, accident, a riding accident on the road between Las Cruces and Harlan's Crossing. His horse had thrown him. He had struck his head on a rock. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. She had never believed it. She had also never said so out loud to anyone, because she had no proof, because she had no money for a lawyer, because she was 18 and alone, and half Apache in a territory where that combination of facts was approximately as useful as being half ghost, and ghosts, in Wren's experience, did not win arguments about how people died. So she had come to Harlan's Crossing, because her father had worked here, because this was the last place he'd been seen alive, because some part of her, the stubborn, stupid, inconvenient part, she had never fully managed to bury, believed that the truth was close, that the town was sitting on top of it, the way towns sit on top of old wells, the water still there, still cold, still real, just out of reach. 7 years. She had been looking for 7 years, and the town had been looking right through her, which meant she could look back without anyone noticing. The chest at the foot of her bed, she thought about it while she worked, not obsessively, not the way a person thinks about something that frightens them, more the way you think about a piece of fruit that isn't ripe yet. You know it's there. You check it occasionally. You understand that the moment to deal with it is not yet now, but also that it will be, and that when that moment comes, you need to be ready. Her father had left her 2 things. The first was a Remington 1858 0.44 caliber, converted from cap and ball to take metallic cartridges, because her father had been a practical man, and a practical man prepares for the future even when the future isn't clear. The grip was worn smooth in the places where his hand had found it 10,000 times. The barrel was clean because she cleaned it every week, the way he had taught her, because a gun that is not maintained is not a tool, it is a liability, and Wren had enough of those already. She was a very good shot. She did not let anyone know this. The second thing he had left her was an envelope, sealed. Wax. His initials pressed into the wax with his ring PB, connected by a small line that might have been a bridge or might have been wings, depending on how the light hit it. On the front, in his handwriting, for Ren, when there is no other choice. She had been 18 when she received it. She was 25 now. It was still sealed, because she had not yet reached no other choice. Because every morning she woke up and assessed, and found that there were still choices, still ways through, still the possibility of the next day being the one where something broke open that didn't break her. And so she had not opened it, had not let herself open it, because once it was open, it was open. And she suspected the way you suspect things, that you aren't ready to know that what was inside that envelope was going to make her life significantly more complicated than it already was. She was, on the whole, correct about this. The Monday in question began normally enough, which is what Mondays do, right up until the moment they don't. She finished the Abbott laundry by 9, delivered the widow Drummond's mended curtains by 10, stopped at the general store to buy thread gray, medium weight. There was a jacket belonging to one of the Abbott boys that was coming apart at the shoulder seam, and managed the interaction with Mrs. Calloway at the counter in the manner she had perfected over 7 years, which was to be present enough to complete the transaction, and invisible enough that the moment she left Mrs. Calloway would not be able to recall whether she'd been served by Wren or by a moderately polite breeze. She was on her way back to her room to start on the actual sewing work when she passed the bank. She didn't mean to look up. She looked up. Second floor. The window. Aldous Pritchard. 9:15. Later than usual. He was looking east, toward the Manzanos. The expression on his face, that quiet, hunting animal stillness, was more pronounced than she had ever seen it, more focused, like something had sharpened his attention to a point. And then he looked down, directly at her. She had already looked away. She was already 3 steps past the bank, head down, thread in her basket, completely invisible. But for 1/2 of 1 second, she had seen his face, when it found her, and for 1/2 of 1 second, something had moved behind his eyes. Recognition, not the vague social recognition of a man who knows a woman works in his town. Something more specific than that. Something that placed her precisely, the way you place a piece on a board game. You look at a piece and you think, that one. That's the one I need to deal with. She kept walking. She did not run. Running was visible. She kept walking, and she counted her steps. And she held the basket against her hip, and she did not let her face change. But her heart was doing something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was paying attention. That afternoon, she was in the back room of her rented space, working through the Abbott jacket by the window light, when someone knocked at the door. Not Mrs. Calloway's knock. She had a specific rhythm, 2 quick and 1 slow, the unconscious signature of a woman who had spent decades communicating through doors. This was a single knock, deliberate, unhurried, the knock of someone who had decided to knock and was not uncertain about having decided. Wren set down the jacket. She looked at the door for a moment. She looked at the chest. She looked at the door again. She opened it. The man standing outside was perhaps 50, perhaps less. The kind of age that's hard to read on certain faces because the lines come not from years, but from specific things that happened in those years. And those things had been the kind that carved deep. He had gray-blue eyes, a long scar running from his left ear to the line of his jaw, old, clean, the scar of something that had been bad enough to leave a mark and not bad enough to kill him. He stood slightly tilted to the right, taking more weight on his right leg than his left, the adjustment so habitual that it was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She was always looking for things. She noticed. He had a Colt Peacemaker on his right hip and a general air of someone who had been in a significant number of places and was in no particular hurry to perform the social rituals that typically surrounded arrival in a new one. He said, "You're Birdthorne's daughter." Not a question. Patrick Birdthorne's daughter. She said nothing. Because that statement, delivered in that way, by that kind of man, at her door in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in October of 1878, was not an opening pleasantry. It was a declaration of some kind. She just didn't know yet what it was declaring. "My name is Devereux Grawl," the man said. "I knew your father." She did not invite him in. She was not yet that kind of trusting. She stepped outside instead, which put her in the narrow passage between the back of the dry goods store and the fence that separated it from the adjacent lot. A space that was technically not quite public and not quite private, which suited her. You could see both ends of it from where you stood. No ambushes, no corners. She stood with her back to the wall and looked at him. He seemed to understand the logic of this. He stood where he was, not crowding, giving her the full length of the passage between them. He had a face that had been through something. Not dramatically, not in the way of men who wore their suffering as theater, who wanted you to see how much they'd endured. Just in the basic structural way of someone whose worst moments had left deposits on them, the way minerals leave deposits in rock. Slow, quiet, permanent. She said, "How did you know him?" "I worked for the Territorial Land Bureau," Grawl said. 1869 through 1874. Las Cruces office. She waited. "He was a good man," Grawl said. "Careful. Particular about things being done correctly. In that office, at that time, that made him." He paused, seemed to be choosing the next word the way you choose where to step in uncertain ground. "Unusual." "He's dead," Wren said. "I know. 4 years dead. I know that too. So if you're here to tell me what kind of man he was." "I'm not." She stopped. He looked at her directly. Not the way men who thought they were being respectful looked at her, that slightly too deliberate eye contact. That performance of not noticing she was half Indian, but the way someone looks at you when they're trying to figure out how much you already know and whether what they're about to say is going to help or simply make things worse. "I'm here," Grawl said slowly, "because I heard something. A few weeks ago. In Albuquerque. About a land deed. Your father's name on it." The air went out of the passage, or it felt like it did. Wren did not move, did not change her expression. She had practiced that, keeping her face like still water, letting nothing break the surface, and she was excellent at it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "No," Grawl said. "You probably don't. Not yet." He looked east for a moment, toward the mountains she could see between the buildings. "But you're going to." She went back inside. She did not invite him to come back, did not ask where he was staying, did not give him anything he could use as a thread to pull. She sat on the edge of her cot for a long time after his footsteps had retreated down the alley. A land deed. Her father's name. The man had said it, the way you say something that you know is a bomb, and you're trying to set it down very carefully, and you're not entirely sure it isn't already burning. She looked at the chest, the sealed envelope. For Wren, when there is no other choice, she looked at it for a long time. Then she got up, picked up the Abbott jacket, sat back down by the window, and went back to sewing. Because it wasn't time yet, because she still had choices, because she was afraid. And she hated that about herself, and she kept sewing, and the needle went in and out, and the mountains turned amber in the late afternoon light, and Aldous Pritchard, on the second floor of his bank, went on watching them. She first heard Aldous Pritchard's name a week after she arrived in Harlan's Crossing. 7 years ago. She'd been 18, exhausted, running low on money, and even lower, on the kind of hope that gets you out of bed in the morning. She had taken the laundry work because it was available, and didn't require her to be anyone in particular. You showed up, you collected the clothes, you brought them back clean. Nobody asked you questions. She had learned in that first week that Pritchard owned the bank, controlled the majority of the town's water rights, sat on the territorial council, and was, in the words of the widow Drummond, who was the first person in Harlan's Crossing to speak to Wren with anything approaching actual interest, the kind of man who makes the town run smoothly by making sure there's only ever one answer to any question, and that answer always has his name on it. She had not paid much attention. She had been 18 and grieving and trying to figure out how to eat, but she had filed it away. She filed everything away. It was the one discipline she maintained absolutely. Whatever else was taken from her comfort, dignity, the basic human luxury of being seen, her memory was hers. No one could reach into it. No one could revise it. The things she put in there stayed exactly as she had received them, unchanged, waiting. In 7 years, she had accumulated a great deal. She just didn't always know what it was for. She made a decision that evening. Not the decision about the envelope, she was not ready for that one yet, but a smaller one, adjacent to it. A preparatory decision. She would find out what Devereaux Grawl was actually doing in Harlan's Crossing. Not by asking him. Not directly. That would give him too much of her attention. Too much information about what she did or didn't know. Too much of herself as a visible interested party. She would find out the way she found out everything. By watching. By being the furniture that sees. She went to the saloon. Not inside. She had never gone inside the saloon. And she was not about to start now. Because a half Apache woman walking into the saloon in Harlan's Crossing on a Monday evening was a statement she could not afford to make. But the saloon had a side window that faced the alley, and the alley was dark enough, and she was good enough at dark, and standing still that she could stand there for a while without being particularly noticed. She watched for 40 minutes. Grawl was at the bar, alone, nursing a single glass of whiskey with the dedication of a man for whom the drink was not really the point. His back was to the wall, actually turned the stool, so his back was to the wall, which you didn't do unless you had developed, over many years, a very specific relationship with rooms and the people who might enter them. He was watching the space with the same quality of attention that she watched towns with. Not obvious, not intense, just continuous. Two men came in that she recognized as working for Pritchard. Not his toughs. His administrative men. Bennett Shear was one of them, the bank clerk with the Thursday appointments. The other was a man called Renfrew, who worked as a land assessor for the county and was, as far as Wren could determine, Pritchard's professional instrument for making inconvenient ownership situations become convenient ones. They did not approach Grawl. They noticed him. She saw the moment they noticed him, the small arrest of attention, the exchanged look, and then the very deliberate performance of not noticing. That is actually a more intense form of noticing. They knew who he was, or they knew what he was, and whatever that was, it had made them careful. She walked home in the dark. The wind off the Manzanos had died to a whisper. The stars were very clear. She did not look up at them because she was thinking. She had a system for the mornings. Not written down, nothing like that. Written things could be found. But in her head, in the precise and uncluttered way, she kept everything that mattered. She had a sequence, a choreography of the invisible. 4:15, rise. Not because she set anything no clock in her room, because clocks ticked, and ticking could be heard through thin walls, and thin walls were the only kind her wages afforded, but because her body had learned the hour. The way bodies learn things that are repeated long enough. The dark before the dark changes. The particular quality of silence at 4:15 that is different from the silence at 3. Though she could not have explained how she knew this, she just knew. She had always known. 4:20, dress. This took 2 minutes. Exactly 2 minutes. She had timed it in her head once, counting because she was curious about the mechanics of herself, the way some people are curious about clocks or engines. 2 minutes from bare to dressed, cotton underclothes that she washed every Sunday evening and hung inside her room, never outside, because outside meant visible, and visible meant questions. The work dress, which she owned 3 of identical, same faded brown, same practical cut, quality of being as unremarkable as cloth can be, while still technically constituting clothing. Boots. The boots were the one expenditure she did not economize on, because boots that fell apart, left you stranded and stranded, was a condition she could not afford. Good boots. Resoled twice. Still good. 4:30 the chest. She unlocked it, looked at what was inside, counted it silently the way she always counted. Not because the count ever changed, she knew the inventory of that chest better than she knew her own face, but because counting was its own kind of ceremony. A confirmation. I have what I have. I am what I am. This is the day I have to work with. The Remington. The ammunition. A small roll of cash. The accumulation of months of laundry payments. Never enough to be significant. Always enough to be the difference between staying and having to leave. A folded handkerchief that had been her mother's. A photograph. Small. The kind that cost more than she could easily afford, but that she had spent the money on anyway. Her father, standing outside the Las Cruces Land Bureau office, squinting into the sun, looking like a man who has just done something he believes in, and the envelope. She locked the chest again. She went to work. The route from her room to the Abbott house on Crest Street took 11 minutes at her standard pace, 7 if she moved fast, which she almost never did because moving fast attracted attention, and attention attracted the specific kind of social scrutiny that she was constitutionally opposed to. 11 minutes. She knew every board of every boardwalk on that route, knew which ones creaked and which were silent, knew which storefronts had early risers behind their windows and which stayed dark until 7, knew where the dogs were chained and where they ran loose, and approximately what time they shifted from territorial to merely curious. She knew this town. She knew it the way a cartographer knows a territory, not by walking it once and marking the features, but by crossing and recrossing it hundreds of times, in every light and every weather, until the map inside her head was more complete than anything that had ever been written on paper. 7 years. That was a long time to learn a place, especially a place that was actively trying not to be learned by you. The Abbott house. Mrs. Abbott met her at the back door, which was the arrangement. Wren never went to the front door. Not because anyone had said anything, but because the geography of class and race in Harlan's Crossing was communicated through architecture, through which doors were for whom, and Wren had learned to read those communications without waiting for them to be explained. Back door. She collected the laundry in baskets. She counted the pieces, because Mrs. Abbott's accounting of what she'd sent out and what came back had never matched Wren's memory. And twice there had been arguments, and twice Wren had been correct. And the third time she had begun counting aloud in front of Mrs. Abbott, slowly, deliberately, watching Mrs. Abbott's face understand that the argument she was preparing to have was an argument she would lose, which was the end of the arguments. She counted. She left. The widow Drummond's house came next. Mended curtains returned. The widow's house smelled of lavender and something older, the smell of a space that had been occupied by one person for so long that their specific chemistry had seeped into the walls. The widow was kind, distantly, vaguely kind, the way that people are kind when they have enough of everything they need and therefore have no practical reason not to be. She sometimes left a biscuit on top of the laundry basket. Not always. No pattern to it, which was its own kind of statement. You cannot plan for this generosity. It does not operate on your schedule. It is given when I choose to give it. Wren ate the biscuits without comment. They were good biscuits. The rectory. The basket on the step. The door never opened. Father Ignacio had never spoken to her directly. She had watched him, of course. She watched everyone. He was a small man, Mexican by origin, with the particular stillness of someone who had decided very deliberately what kind of man he was going to be and had held to it without visible effort for a long time. He was fair in his dealings, from what she could observe. He gave no one preferential treatment and no one the cold shoulder, and his neutrality in town affairs was the enforced neutrality of a man who understood that the moment a priest takes a side in a land dispute, he stops being a priest and becomes a partisan, which is a useful thing to be, but not the thing he had chosen. She liked him, in the way she liked things she observed and approved of from a distance. She never told anyone this. She never told anyone most things. That was the practice. That was the discipline. That was 7 years of it, until the discipline had become something indistinguishable from nature, which was its own kind of loss that she thought about, sometimes at 4:15 in the morning, in the specific silence that was different from 3 o'clock, lying on her cot with her eyes open and the mountains somewhere in the dark to the east. She had, she suspected, forgotten how to want things out loud. Not entirely. The envelope was proof of that, the fact that she had not opened it, the fact that she was waiting for exactly the right moment, the fact that she had a plan, even if the plan had never been written down anywhere, even if it lived entirely in the precise and uncluttered filing system of her memory. But the smaller wanting, the daily kind. She had been careful with that for so long that she was no longer sure where the careful ended and the actual not wanting began. She thought about this sometimes. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it cost something, and she was already operating on tight margins. She went back to work, the thread from the general store, the Abbott boy's jacket, the shoulder seam that had been pulling for 3 weeks, worn by a boy who was growing too fast for his clothes to keep up with him, which was the kind of problem that was temporary and would resolve itself, which was more than could be said for most problems. She worked through the afternoon in the window light, which was the best light she had, because the room faced southwest, and in October the afternoon sun came in at an angle that made everything gold for about 2 hours before it dropped behind the buildings across the way. She worked, she thought. She watched the bank window out of the corner of her vision. Not the whole time. Not obsessively. Just the peripheral awareness she maintained for things she had classified as worth monitoring. Pritchard at his window was a thing she had classified as worth monitoring approximately 3 months after she arrived in Harlan's Crossing, when she had realized that the pattern of his morning window standing was not incidental. He was looking at something. He was looking for something, and the direction of his gaze always east. Always the Manzanos told her something about what the something was. She just hadn't known for 7 years. What? Now she had a very specific and uncomfortable suspicion. She worked the seam. The needle went in. The needle came out. The mountains held the afternoon light and gave nothing away. There were things she had learned in 7 years about how power operated in small towns. It was not the way books described it. In books, power was dramatic. Power made speeches. Power had minions who wore their allegiance openly. Power announced itself with brass and thunder. In Harlan's Crossing, power was a pattern of loans. Pritchard owned the bank. The bank held mortgages on most of the commercial properties in town. The terms of those mortgages were, by all outward appearance, standard reasonable interest, reasonable repayment schedules, nothing that would flag itself as unusual in a territorial audit. But the terms could be adjusted. They were adjusted periodically in ways that were technically at the bank's discretion, and that corresponded in ways that were not technically provable but that were entirely obvious to anyone paying attention, with the willingness of the borrower to cooperate with whatever Pritchard happened to need cooperating with at that moment. It was elegant. It was invisible. It was exactly the kind of power that persisted because it never had to show its face. She had watched it for 7 years. She had mapped it. She had, at various points, thought about what it would take to dismantle it, and had arrived each time at the same answer, which was, not now. Not with what you have. Not yet. The yet had felt, for most of those 7 years, like a piece of furniture she was moving around in her head, always present, always in the room, occasionally in the way, but not yet in its final position. The yet had found its position, she thought, this Monday, when Devereaux Grawl appeared at her door, when his name, printed in the hand of a Federal Land Bureau agent, had surfaced in a sealed envelope that had been waiting 7 years to be opened. The yet had arrived. And the question now was not whether she was ready for it. The question was whether she could make herself ready fast enough. She worked the seam. The needle went in. The Abbott boy's jacket was going to hold now. The shoulder would not pull again, not with the reinforcement she'd put in, not unless the boy had another 6 months of growing at the current rate, which was possible, boys being what they were. She cut the thread. She folded the jacket. She looked at the mountains. Still there. Always still there. She had grown up looking at different mountains, the mountains of the reservation, which her mother had not been born on, but had been moved to, which were not her family's mountains, but were mountains nonetheless, stone and sky, the basic grammar of a landscape that said, the world is larger than the people in it. Whatever those people have decided about whose it is, her grandfather had told her about these mountains, the Manzanos. Not by name, he had his own name for them, in the language that Wren had fragments of, but not the whole, the way you have fragments of a song when you haven't heard it often enough to learn all the words. He had told her that his family had always been from this place, that the specific quality of the light off those peaks at certain hours was a thing he carried with him, the way you carry a smell, involuntary, immediate, pristine thought. He had not lived to see this day either. She thought about that, the particular loneliness of being the last person who knows something, the last vessel, the last repository of a truth that depends on you staying alive and coherent long enough to pass it on. Her grandfather had passed it to her father. Her father had passed it to her. Now it was her turn. She did not know yet who she would pass it to, but she was beginning to understand that the first step was making sure there was something worth passing on. The land. Legal. Documented. Hers. That was the first step. She was working on it. The jacket was folded on the table. The light was going gold. She picked up the next piece of mending. She went back to work. Harlan's Crossing had 17 businesses on its main street, not counting the bank, which was not a business the way the others were. A business, it was a different category of institution, more like weather, something that affected everything without being particularly affected by anything. She had a working relationship with most of those 17 businesses. Working meaning she washed their proprietors' clothes, or their wives' clothes, or their children's clothes. She mended what needed mending. She was competent, reliable, and appropriately priced, which was to say, priced below what a white woman would have charged for the same work, because that was the going rate for her particular combination of race and gender in 1,878 New Mexico territory. And she had calculated early on that the cost of fighting that particular injustice was higher than the cost of accepting it in the short term, while she focused on something larger. 7 years was a long short term. But here she was, still, working. She had relationships with all of these people, these 17 business owners and their families. The relationships were entirely professional, conducted with minimal language and maximum efficiency, and they had given her, over 7 years, a window into the interior life of Harlan's Crossing that most residents didn't have. Because when you do someone's laundry, you know things. You know, for example, that the Calloway family's linen was stained most months in ways that told a story about their diet and their health and their domestic arrangements that no one would have told you voluntarily. You know that the hotel owner, Garrett Fell, slept in his good shirts on nights when he'd been drinking because the shirts came back wrinkled in ways that were inconsistent with normal wear. You know that Renfrew, the land assessor, had recently begun sending out clothes that smelled of a woman's perfume that was not his wife's, which was a fact of no immediate utility, but which she filed away because she filed everything. Because she had learned that facts had a habit of becoming useful at unexpected moments. She knew Casper Dole's work shirts, 4 of them. Same cut, same color, a dark blue that hid dirt efficiently, which was a practical choice for a man who did the kind of work Dole did. She had mended a tear in the right sleeve of one of them, 3 months ago, a clean tear, the kind that comes from catching on something metal, not the fraying kind. She had wondered, briefly, what Dole had been doing to tear his sleeve on metal. She had filed it away. She had filed Dole himself away. Not the details, those were specific, and she held them clearly, but the assessment of him. What kind of man he was, what his limits were, what his line was, and how close to it he had gotten, over the years, and how often he'd stepped back from it. He had stepped back. That was the interesting thing. She had watched Dole operate for 7 years, had seen him involved in situations that were at the edges of legality, in service of Pritchard's interests, had seen him do things that she did not approve of and that occupied a moral territory she found troubling. But she had also seen him, twice, decline to do things. She had not known the context of those refusals, could not know it, watching from outside. But she had seen in both cases the particular stillness of a man who has been asked to cross a line he has drawn for himself and is considering his options. He had not crossed it, either time. This did not make him a good man. She was not naive about that. A man who does bad things but has a limit is still doing bad things. The limit is not exculpatory. It is simply a fact about the structure of his character, and facts about character are useful data, and she collected useful data. The fact about Dole was, he had a line, and the question, when they came for her in the lane, had been whether what they were asking him to do was on the right side of the line or the wrong side. She had been in that moment genuinely uncertain, but Grawl had stepped out of the saloon, and the calculation had changed, and Dole had folded the paper and put it away, which told her something. Not that Dole was her ally, not that he would help her, but that his limit was real, and that the right pressure at the right moment might mean he stepped back from a worse thing. She tucked that away. She was going to need every piece of information she had. The gold light faded. She lit the lamp. She kept working. Outside, somewhere in the town, Aldous Pritchard was making decisions. She did not know exactly what decisions, but she knew the shape of the situation, and the shape told her that he was not a man who accepted failure quietly or gracefully, that the lane that evening had been a setback and not a defeat, and that the next move was coming. She needed to be ready for it before it arrived. She set down the mending. She went to the chest. She looked at the envelope. Not yet, but soon. Very soon now. The thing about being invisible for 7 years is that you get very good at it, and then one day something happens that makes you realize that you were never actually invisible at all. You were just being preserved, put aside. left alone until needed. She understood this, she thought. She had always known, somewhere below the line of conscious thought, that the stillness of her life in Harlan's Crossing was not her own creation. She was small and poor and half Indian and female, in a place and time where any one of those conditions was sufficient to make you easily ignorable. And the combination of all four made her as close to socially non-existent as a breathing person could be. She had told herself that she had chosen this, that she had built this carefully, that the invisibility was a tool she wielded. But tools don't get preserved. They get used. Things get preserved when someone is waiting for the right moment to use them. She was in her room, in the dark, not sleeping. The chest at the foot of her bed, the sealed envelope. She could feel it even in the dark, not literally, not the way the superstitious imagine objects carrying weight, just the awareness of it. The way you're always aware of the door you haven't opened yet. For Wren, when there is no other choice, she had options. She could leave Harlan's Crossing, could pack what little she owned in the next hour, and be on the road before midnight, could go north to Santa Fe, south to El Paso, west to Arizona. She was not physically trapped. She had the means to leave. She had, if she was honest, always had the means to leave. She had never left. Because of him. Because of her father. Because of the thing she was not ready to name directly, but that had been holding her in this town for 7 years like a fishhook that she couldn't get her hand free of. The thing that whispered every time she considered leaving, but what really happened? But you don't know yet. But if you go, you'll never know. And if you don't know, then he's just gone. Uncounted. A man who fell off a horse. That was not acceptable. She had decided that when she was 18, and she had not undecided it since, and she did not undecide it now. She turned over on her cot. She would not leave. She would watch Devereaux Grawl. She would find out what he knew. She would still not open the envelope. Not yet. Tomorrow she would wash the Abbott's curtains. Tuesday. Wednesday. She watched Grawl. He was methodical. She could appreciate that at least. Whatever he was doing in Harlan's Crossing, he was doing it with the systematic patience of someone who understood that haste in situations like these was not your friend. He visited the land records office on Tuesday morning. She saw him come out 40 minutes later with the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for and was not pleased about it. He stood on the step outside the office for a moment, looking east at the mountains, and she recognized that look. She had made that look herself. The look of someone fitting a piece into a puzzle and not liking what the picture was becoming. And then Pritchard's men watched Grawl, and Grawl knew they were watching him. She could see it, the slight adjustment in how he moved through town, the way he altered his routes just enough to acknowledge that he knew he was being observed without giving away that he was adjusting. It was a performance of obliviousness that was actually a very sophisticated piece of spatial intelligence. You had to know how to move through space with a lot of attention paid to you before you could manage that particular act. She found herself thinking, he knows what he's doing. And then, but what is he doing? And then uncomfortably, and why did he come to my door first? Thursday evening. She was heading home from delivering the Drummond laundry, taking the back route she always took, not Crest Street, not the main thoroughfare, but the parallel lane behind the buildings that ran from the north end of town to the south end, and was used primarily for deliveries and dogs, and people who, for various reasons, found the main street inconvenient. She was 3 blocks from her room. They came from 2 directions. That was the thing she noticed first. Even before she had fully registered what was happening, they had come from 2 directions, which meant it was planned. It wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't a group of drunk men who'd spotted an unaccompanied woman and decided to be unpleasant about it. This was deliberate. This was arranged. 3 men. 2 from the end of the lane in front of her, cutting off the path forward. 1 from behind, closing the way back. She recognized one of the 2 in front. His name was Casper Dole. He worked at Pritchard's bank, not a desk man like Shear, more of a physical presence, the kind of employee that a man like Pritchard kept for situations that required a more direct kind of solution than paperwork. She didn't know the other 2. She did know, looking at them, that this was not going to be a conversation she wanted to have. She stopped. They stopped. 1 second of everyone recognizing what was happening. Casper Dole said pleasantly, "Miss Birdthorne, Mr. Pritchard was hoping you'd have a moment," she said. It's late for business. Yes, ma'am. Apologies for that. Mr. Pritchard. He doesn't sleep too regular. Still pleasant. Still the pleasantness of a man holding a larger hand than you and being too professional to gloat about it. He was hoping you could come sign some papers. Property matter. Property matter. She kept her face still. I don't have any property, she said. Yes, ma'am. That's the matter. The man behind her had moved 2 steps closer. She felt it, without looking, not heard it. Felt it, the change in the proximity of another body in a dark lane. Mr. Pritchard's a very reasonable man, Dole said. Very fair. He said to tell you there'd be compensation. $200 cash money, deed transfer, and free passage north if you wanted it. She said, free passage for what? Signature. On what? Dole reached inside his coat, brought out a folded paper. He took a step forward and held it out, and she had to decide in that moment whether to reach for it, which would bring her within his range, or to stand where she was. She stood where she was. What's on that paper? She said. Property transfer. Your father's land, up in the Manzanos. My father didn't own land in the Manzanos. She said it the way she'd said I don't know what you're talking about to Grawl. Flat, empty. A door that wasn't there. But Dole's face did something she hadn't expected. It said yes he did. And you know it. And we know you know it, Mr. Pritchard, Dole said, is willing to be generous about the misunderstanding. But he needs the paper signed. Tonight, if possible. Tonight, she repeated. If possible. The man behind her was close enough now that she could hear his breathing. She said, I need to see a lawyer before I sign anything. Dole nodded thoughtfully, as if this were a very reasonable thing to say. That's your right, of course. Beat. Course. The only lawyer in Harlan's Crossing is Harmon Fitch, and Mr. Pritchard is his primary client. So, I want to see him anyway. Another thoughtful nod. Well, we can arrange that first thing in the morning. If you'd just come with us now. No, she said. The pleasantness went off Dole's face the way a lamp goes off when someone cuts the fuel. It didn't become anger. That would have been almost better. It became something blank and functional. The face of a man moving from one phase of a plan to another. He looked at the man behind her. She turned to look too, and then the door at the back of the saloon swung open, and light fell into the lane, and a man walked out. She had not heard him come out. That was the thing. The door was 10 feet to her left, set into the back wall of the saloon, and she had not heard it open. Had not heard his footsteps before that. He was just there, in the light from the open door, standing in the lane with his coat open, and his right hand loose at his side, and his gray-blue eyes moving across the situation, the way you look at a thing and immediately understand its essential geometry. Jivera Grawl. He looked at her. He looked at the 3 men. He looked at the paper in Dole's hand. He said, Evening, Casper. Dole went very still. Dev, he said. No longer pleasant. No longer anything in particular. Just a word in a dark lane. She said no, Grawl said. The 2 men looked at each other. The man behind Wren made a small shift in his weight. Not forward, not back. The kind of micro-movement that was all potential and no action yet. This isn't your business, Dole said. No, Grawl agreed. It isn't. He didn't move. He didn't put his hand on his gun. Didn't square his shoulders. Didn't perform any of the rituals of masculine threat that Wren had observed men performing her entire life. He just stood there with his gray-blue eyes and his stillness and the complete absolute quality of someone who has decided something and is waiting to see if reality is going to cooperate with his decision. The man behind Wren took a step back, then another. Dole folded the paper, put it back in his coat. Mr. Pritchard's going to be disappointed, he said. People generally are, Grawl said. Dole looked at Wren. The look lasted exactly long enough to communicate exactly what he intended it to communicate, which was, this isn't over. Not even close. Then he turned and walked away, and the other 2 followed him, and the lane was empty except for Grawl and Wren, and the light from the saloon door and the sound of the wind finding its way between the buildings. She stood completely still. Her heart was doing something very loud. She was focusing very hard on not showing that. Grawl looked at her. Not with the look people gave her when they'd just done something for her. Not the expectant look, the look that said, you owe me an emotion right now. Just the direct, assessing look of someone checking to see if she was all right. She was all right. She was, in fact, furious. But that was internal. That was hers. That went into the file drawer with everything else. What did they want? He said. Signature, she said. Land transfer. He absorbed this. Manzano's land? She looked at him. You already knew, she said. Not the specifics. He looked down the lane in the direction Dole and the others had gone. But I knew the shape of it. He looked back at her. The land's worth a lot more than they've told you. I don't have any land, he said. Ren. Just her name. Just that. The way her father used to say her name when she was trying to talk herself out of something she already knew was true. She hated how much that worked. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the cot. She looked at the chest. She looked at it for a long time. The wind outside, the mountains beyond the town, the distant sound of the saloon, which had no business with her and she with it, the quiet of the lane where 3 men had been and now were not. Property matter, Dole had said. Your father's land. I don't have any property. But her hands, she noticed. Her hands, which she had kept folded in her lap, completely still, completely controlled, throughout the entire encounter in the lane. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the trembling that comes when the thing you have been waiting for, not the thing you wanted, not the thing you chose, but the thing that was always coming, the thing the whole shape of your life had been oriented toward, without your conscious permission. Finally, conscience finally arrives, for Ren, when there is no other choice. She got up. She went to the chest. She unlocked it. She took out the envelope. She looked at her father's handwriting for a long time. Then she broke the wax seal, not violently, not dramatically, just pressed her thumb in at the edge where the wax met the paper and held until it gave, and she opened it. 2 things inside. A letter written on Land Bureau letterhead, official and specific, and a folded document beneath it, more formal, with the stamps and signatures of federal authority. She read the letter first. It was short. Her father was not a man who wasted words. Rin, by the time you read this, either something has happened to me or I've finally run out of reasons to wait. The document beneath this letter is a land deed, registered with the Territorial Land Bureau in September of 1871, covering 480 acres in the Manzano Mountains, eastern boundary from the creek to the ridge, north to south from the old Apache trail markers. The deed is in your name. I registered it in your name because I knew they would come for me eventually, and I needed the deed to be held by someone they had no reason to look at. The land was your grandfather's. Your mother's father. He asked me to make it official he'd lived on it all his life, and he wanted it to be your mother's, and then yours. And he knew the only way to make that stick in a territorial court was to have a federal document with a seal on it. So I made one. I was within my authority to do so. I did it correctly. It will hold in court. There is silver on that land, Ren. Or there will be. The survey I ran in 1870 showed the geology of it. Someone more knowledgeable than me will figure it out eventually if they haven't already. When that happens, people will come. Be ready. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to explain this myself. Father. She read it twice. Then she set it down. Then she picked up the land deed. Federal letterhead. Department of the Interior. General Land Office. The specific legal language of territorial land registration. All the correct clauses. All the correct references to the Homestead Act of 1862 and the subsequent territorial regulations. Her name. The acreage. The boundaries. The description of the land in precise surveying language. And at the bottom, the signature of the certifying Land Bureau agent. D.F. Grawl. Agent, New Mexico Territory Land Bureau. She sat with that for a moment. Then she sat with it for another moment. Then she said, out loud to the empty room, of course. She did not sleep. She lay on the cot with the land deed on the chest and her father's letter folded back inside the envelope and the Remington on the floor beside her where she could reach it without sitting up. She thought about her father. Not the large things, not the grief, not the absence, not the fact of his death that she still did not believe was an accident. The small things, the way he'd said her name, the way he'd shown her how to load the Remington, patient, specific, making sure she understood each step rather than just going through them. The way he'd looked at her, sometimes when he didn't know she was looking at him, with an expression she had always thought was something like helpless love, the kind you feel for someone you know you can't fully protect, and that you love them anyway, and that knowing you can't protect them only makes the love bigger, not smaller, which seems paradoxical, but is one of the fundamental truths of having someone to love. He had known they were coming. He had not warned her directly, because warning her directly would have put her in the picture, made her visible, given whoever was coming a reason to look at her as well. Instead, he had made her invisible in a new way, by putting something enormously valuable in her hands and making sure she didn't know she was holding it. Until now, she thought about the mining survey, silver in the Manzanos. If her father had seen the geology of it in 1870, and Aldous Pritchard had been looking east at those mountains every morning for years with that quiet hunting animal expression, then Pritchard had figured it out too. And Pritchard had been waiting. For 7 years, Pritchard had been waiting for someone to produce that land deed. And for 7 years, she had been living in his town, working in his town, invisible in his town, with the land deed sitting in a locked chest in a room behind his general store. The irony of it was so complete that she almost laughed. Almost. She lay on the cot. She breathed. She thought about Devereaux Grawl and his signature on the deed, and the fact that he had appeared in Harlan's Crossing in the same week that Pritchard had apparently decided to stop waiting and start moving. That was not a coincidence. She had never believed in coincidences. She did not start now. She thought, he knew. He's known for a while. And he came here because he owed her father something. Or because the signature on the deed meant that if this went wrong in a particular way, it would have his name on it. Any of those. All of those. She didn't know yet. She was going to find out. Before dawn. She was up, dressed, hair pinned, Remington loaded and holstered beneath her coat in the inside rig she'd made herself, because the inside rig was invisible, and visible was not something she could afford to be. The land deed was folded inside her dress, against her skin. She went to the general store, first the front, not the back. Mrs. Calloway was not yet open, but Wren knew where the spare key was kept, because she'd been collecting laundry from this building for 7 years, and the Calloways were not particularly careful people. She let herself in, left exact payment for a length of oilskin cloth and a spool of waxed thread, and left again before the Calloways were awake. She wrapped the land deed in the oilskin, stitched it shut with the waxed thread, wrapped it again, tucked it back against her skin. It wasn't safe there. Nowhere was entirely safe, but it was safer than the chest. The chest was the first place anyone would look. She was not going to be the first place anyone looked. The land records office opened at 8. She was outside it at 7:50. The man who ran it was called Simeon Pratt, and he was a territorial government employee of the kind that have existed in all administrations. Everywhere, a man who had found a small, specific authority and settled into it completely, who knew his files the way a priest knows scripture, who was not corrupt, but who was not brave either, who did his job with conscientiousness and without a great deal of curiosity about the larger context in which he was doing it. He recognized her, in the way that everyone in Harlan's Crossing recognized her, the brief, involuntary notation of her face, the rapid filing of it under the Indian girl, the laundry woman, not relevant to my current interests. She said, "I need to register a document." He looked at her, over the edge of his spectacles. "Office opens at 8. It's 8. He looked at the clock on his desk. It was 3 minutes to. He looked at her. She waited. He pulled open the door. She handed him the oilskin-wrapped document. He unwrapped it with the care of a man who handles paper for a living and has opinions about how paper should be handled. He read it. She watched his face. He read it again. He said, very carefully, "This is registered in the federal system." "Yes." "This deed has been, when was this filed?" "September 1871, she said. "The registration number is on the lower left." He looked at the lower left. He looked at her. He said, "Miss Birdthorne," she said. "Miss Birdthorne, this land, are you aware that there's been a survey done on the Manzano parcel since this deed was filed?" "No," she said. Which was the truth. The Pritchard Mining Company filed a prospecting claim in 1876 as the same parcel. She kept her face still. "Filed against what title?" she said. Well, Pratt was moving through his files now, not entirely comfortable with where this was going. There was an unclaimed parcel notice. When there's no registered holder. "There was a registered holder," Wren said. "It's in your federal registry." "Well, yes. But if the holder is, if there's been no contact, no activity, the prospecting claim was." He stopped. He had found something in his files. He was looking at it. His face was doing the thing that people's faces do when they encounter a problem they did not cause and cannot fix and desperately wish they had not encountered. The 1876 prospecting claim, he said slowly, was filed by the Pritchard Mining Company. He set the file down. He took off his spectacles. He looked at her. Mr. Pritchard, he said, is going to have a reaction to this. I imagine he will, Wren said. What I need from you is a certified copy of the registration, with today's date and your stamp on it, confirming that this deed is in the federal system and that I am the holder of record. Pratt looked at her. He looked at the deed. He looked at his stamp. He looked out the window in the direction of the bank. Miss Birdthorne, he said, I want you to understand that this office— I understand, she said. I need the stamp. A very long pause. If I stamp this, Pratt said, Mr. Pritchard is going to— I know, she said. The stamp, please. He was a small man with a small authority, and he was not brave. But he was, as she had assessed, not corrupt. He reached for his stamp. She walked out of the land records office with a certified copy in the oilskin, folded inside her dress, and the original deed folded in a different place, also inside her dress, and the Remington under her coat, and the feeling of someone who has just started a fire and is now walking away from it at a pace that does not look like running. She got half a block. Harmon Fitch was standing outside his office. Harmon Fitch, the only lawyer in Harlan's Crossing, Pritchard's primary client. A thin man with a thin face and the nervous energy of someone living in a situation he didn't entirely choose but had not left. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, very quietly, Miss Birdthorne, would you come inside? She did not move. Why? Because, he said, just as quietly, I've been waiting for someone to come out of that land records office with that expression on their face for about 2 years now, and I'd very much like to talk to you before Pratt talks to anyone else. Fitch's office was small and smelled of paper and old coffee. He sat behind his desk. She sat across from him with her back to the wall. He said, your father came to see me in 1873. She said nothing. He knew something was going to happen, Fitch said. He didn't know what exactly, but he was afraid in the careful way that careful men are afraid, where they don't talk about it directly, but they start making arrangements. He asked me hypothetically, he said, but it wasn't hypothetical what the process would be for contesting a prospecting claim filed against a registered federal land deed. He folded his hands on the desk. I told him, Fitch said, everything I knew, which was more than Pritchard knew I knew, which is why— he paused, which is why I'm still here, still breathing, still practicing law in this town, because I learned a very long time ago to be very clear about what I know and what I don't know, in exactly the right proportions to be useful without being threatening. You work for Pritchard, Wren said. Yes. His primary client. He is my largest client. Yes. Fitch looked at her steadily. He is also, at this specific moment, a man who has made a significant legal error that I am not able to advise him on without it being a conflict of interest, because the opposing— slightly toward her. She stared at him. You're telling me, she said slowly, that you can't advise Pritchard in this matter. No, but you can advise me. He was very still. Hypothetically, he said, I could advise anyone who came into my office with a legitimate federal land deed and a certified copy of its registration and a question about their legal standing. She sat with this. Fitch said, the prospecting claim he filed in 1876 is void. It has to be. You have a registered federal deed that predates it by 5 years. In a federal court, that claim doesn't stand up for 30 minutes. Pritchard knows this. Yes. Which is why he's not trying to take it to court. No. He's trying to take it with a signature on a paper in a dark lane. Fitch's face went briefly to something that might have been shame. Yes, he said. She stood up. Miss Birdthorne, Fitch said. She looked at him. I'm telling you this, he said, because your father asked me to. If the day ever came. He asked me to tell you that the document is real. Your claim is real, and the law is on your side. He paused. He also asked me to tell you, and I'm quoting him directly, that the law being on your side and the law protecting you are 2 entirely different things, and not to confuse them. She looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. I've always known that. She walked out. The morning was bright and cold, wind off the mountains. She stood on the boardwalk outside Fitch's office and looked at the sky for a moment and breathed. She had a land deed. She had a certified copy. She had a lawyer who could not represent her, but had just told her everything she needed to know. She had a name on the deed, Devereaux Grawl, who was currently in this town and had specifically come to find her. And she had Aldous Pritchard, who had a void prospecting claim, and a man named Casper Dole, who went to Dark Lanes on his behalf, and who had been looking at her mountains for years with that hunting animal quiet on his face. The law was on her side. The law was not protecting her. She needed it to be. She turned east, toward the Manzanos. She thought, Father. I opened it. I'm ready. The mountains were very still. The sky above them, enormous and blue. She went to find Grawl. She found him at the livery stable. He was brushing down his horse, a big roan, heavily built, the kind of horse that has been through a great deal and knows how to absorb it. He worked with the efficiency of someone who tends to animals not as a performance of care, but as an actual practice of it, like prayer, except less uncertain. He did not look up when she walked in, but his hands slowed slightly. The way a person's hands slow when something enters their awareness and they're deciding what to do with it, she said. I opened the envelope. He said nothing, kept brushing. I know your name is on the deed, she said. The brush stopped. He turned and looked at her. She said, tell me the rest. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the brush down on the rail. He said, how much time do we have? Less than we'd like, she said. More than we need if we're quick. He almost smiled. Just almost. All right, he said. Sit down. She did not sit down. She leaned against the stall and looked at him and waited, and after a moment he recognized that this was simply how she was going to do this, and he started talking. He had been a Land Bureau agent from 1869 to 1874. 5 years in the Las Cruces office, doing the work that nobody thought was important, but that was, in practice, the work that determined who owned what, and therefore who had power and who did not. He had filed deeds. He had surveyed land. He had processed claims. He had, when he believed the claims were legitimate, and the people making them were dealing honestly with a system that was not always honest back, certified them correctly, stamped them, sent them to the Federal Registry. He had certified the Birdthorn deed in September of 1871. He had met Wren's father 6 months before that, in the process of a routine boundary survey. Patrick Birdthorn had been the most careful, most straightforward Land Bureau employee he had ever worked with in an office that was at the time receiving significant pressure from mining interests and land speculators to be less careful and less straightforward about certain things. Birdthorn had refused. Growl had refused. They had been for a time an extremely inconvenient pair of honest men in an increasingly dishonest context. In 1873, Growl had been approached by representatives of a mining consortium based in Santa Fe. They had offered him money to reclassify certain land parcels as unclaimed, specifically parcels held by families who were unlikely to have the political connections or legal resources to contest the reclassification. The Birdthorn parcel was on the list. He had refused. He had also told Birdthorn, and Birdthorn had said, and Grawl could still hear his voice saying it. Then they're going to come for us both. I want you to know I'm grateful you told me, but I want you to know what it means. In 1874, Birdthorn had died in a riding accident. 3 months later, Grawl had been removed from his position on the grounds of administrative irregularities, all fabricated, all entirely sufficient to dismiss him without causing any attention-drawing legal process. He had left Las Cruces, he says. He had for 4 years been doing what men do when they have lost the fight they were in and don't quite know what fight to pick up next. He had been in Albuquerque in September when he heard about the Pritchard Mining Company's recent intensified interest in the Manzano parcel, interests that had apparently accelerated significantly, which meant that they had either recently discovered something about the land's value or recently decided to act on something they had already known. He had come to Harlan's Crossing because his name was on the deed, because if that deed was going to be used in a court of law, he was the only person alive who could testify to its legitimacy from the certifying side, because he had owed Patrick Birdthorn something since 1874 and had not been in a position to pay it back until now. He stopped talking. The roan horse shifted slightly in the stall. Outside, the wind moved through the livery stable's gaps and cracks, Ren said, "How valuable is the land?" "The copper deposit your father identified in his survey." He said silver in the letter. Silver was the first thought. But the survey profile he ran, I saw his notes. He showed me the mineralization pattern is consistent with a copper deposit. Larger, more commercially significant than silver, given where the rail lines are going to go in the next 5 years. "How much?" Grawl looked at her. "The Manzano parcel," he said carefully. "If the deposit is what your father's survey suggested is worth," he paused, "a great deal more than Aldous Pritchard is going to offer you." She thought about $200 cash money and free passage north, she said. "The prospecting claim he filed in 1876 is void." "Yes," Fitch told me. Growl's expression shifted slightly. "You went to Fitch?" "He was waiting for me. Growl processed this. "Your father got to him too. It seems my father was more prepared for this than he let on." "He was," Growl said quietly. "He was a very prepared man. He didn't have enough time. And the people coming for him didn't give him more." She was quiet. He was quiet. The roan horse breathed. She said, "I need 2 things. I need to get the deed to a federal court, and I need someone to testify on the legitimacy of the registration." "Yes." "The nearest federal court is in Santa Fe." "Yes." "That's 3 days' ride." "About that." "Pritchard has people on every road out of Harlan's Crossing." Grawl's eyes met hers. She said, "He's been watching me. He's been watching you since you got here. If we try to ride to Santa Fe tomorrow, we won't make it past the first ridge." "No," he agreed. She pushed off from the stall. She said, "Then we don't go to Santa Fe." He looked at her. She said, "We bring the court here." She told him what she was going to do. He listened. When she was done, he said, "That's either very smart or very dangerous." She said both. She said, "I need 3 days. Pritchard gave you 2. Then I need to move faster." She turned to go. "Ren," he said. She looked back. "Last night," he said. "In the lane. With Dole and his men." He looked at her carefully. "You weren't afraid." "I was afraid," she said. "Not of them." She looked at him. He said, "What were you afraid of?" She considered this. "That I'd let myself be," she said. "Afraid. That I'd sign the paper and take the $200 and go north and spend the rest of my life knowing I'd done it. That I'd become someone who chose that." She paused. "I was afraid of being that person." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "Your father was afraid of the same thing." She turned and walked out of the stable. The wind was sharp and bright. The mountains were very clear against the sky, the way mountains get in autumn. The air washed clean by the change of season, the granite faces picking up the light as if they had opinions about the day. 480 acres up there. Her grandfather's ground. Her mother's ground. Hers. She walked back into Harlan's Crossing with her father's deed against her skin and the Remington under her coat, and 7 years of watching and filing and being invisible settling into something new. Not armor, exactly. Not the careful camouflage she'd been wearing so long. She'd almost forgotten it was a costume. Something else. The shape of a person who has finally picked up the thing they've been circling for years and found that it fits in their hands after all. She walked past the bank. She did not look up at the second-floor window. She did not need to. She knew he was there. Good. Let him watch. She had something to do. The woman no one had bothered to see for 7 years was finally ready to be seen. On her own terms. Or not at all. She had 3 days. Maybe. Probably less. Because Pritchard was not the kind of man who gave you 3 days. He was the kind of man who told you 3 days so you'd relax, so you'd think you had time, so you'd stop moving and start planning instead of the other way around, which was what planning always did to people. It made them stand still while they were drawing the map, and standing still in this kind of situation was the same as digging. She was not going to stand still. She was going to move and think at the same time, which was harder than it sounded, but which she had been practicing in various forms for 7 years. She walked through Harlan's Crossing in the bright October morning, and she cataloged what she had. 1 land deed. Original. Oilskin wrapped against her skin. 1 certified copy. Stamped by Pratt. Different location on her person. 1 retired Land Bureau agent with his name on the deed, and 4 years of conscience looking for somewhere to go. 1 lawyer who could not represent her but who had just told her, in the specific language of a man being as helpful as he could without being seen being helpful, that her legal position was solid. And she had 7 years of watching this town. 7 years of knowing who owed whom, who was afraid of whom, who had something to protect, and who had something to prove, and who had at some point made a compromise they were still paying interest on. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, more than most people walked into a fight with. She was just going to have to figure out how to use it. The most important piece of it. The one that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the lane the night before, since the moment Dole had produced that paper and told her what it was for. Pritchard's prospecting claim was void. Fitch had told her that. Grawl had confirmed it. The federal deed predated the claim by 5 years, which in territorial law was not a close question. It was the kind of case where, in front of a federal judge who hadn't been purchased, you presented the documents and the judge said, yes, and that was more or less the end of it. The problem was not the law. The problem was everything around the law. Getting to a federal judge meant getting to Santa Fe. Getting to Santa Fe meant getting out of Harlan's Crossing, with documents that Pritchard very much wanted her to not have. And getting out of Harlan's Crossing was, as she had told Grawl, probably not possible for either of them without Pritchard knowing before they'd cleared the first ridge. So she needed another way. She had said to Grawl, "We bring the court here," which was not a plan yet. It was the shape of a plan. It was the outline of a thing that she needed to fill in with specific operational details, which was the part of planning that most people skipped because it was boring and because the outline felt like the plan, but was actually just the beginning of figuring out what the plan actually required. She was going to have to figure out what this required. She walked. She thought. The wind pushed at her from the east, from the mountains. The first thing she needed was time. Not much, a day, maybe 2. Enough time to do 3 things that had to happen in a specific order, and that could not be rushed, because rushed things in situations like this had a way of collapsing at the most inconvenient possible moment. She needed to find someone in Santa Fe she could get a message to. Not just anyone. A federal official, someone with the actual authority to compel Pritchard to produce his claim documentation in a legal setting. The kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. The kind that couldn't be purchased in advance, which meant she needed someone Pritchard hadn't already bought. That was harder than it sounded. In New Mexico Territory in 1878, Pritchard's money had been traveling further than she could easily track. But she knew something that most people in Harlan's Crossing didn't know she knew. She knew about the inspector. His name was Callum Reed, Territorial Inspector General, out of the Department of the Interior, Santa Fe office. She had first heard his name 8 months ago, from the widow Drummond, who had mentioned him in the offhand way that widows mention things they don't realize are significant. He had written to her brother, who had some connection to land records in Albuquerque, about irregularities he was investigating in the Territorial Land Registry. His name had appeared in a letter that she had not been supposed to see, but had seen, because she was in the widow's front room collecting laundry, and the letter was on the table, and she had the habit of reading everything in her immediate vicinity, and the further habit of never mentioning that she'd done so. Callum Reed, Inspector General, Santa Fe. She filed it. She had always known she might need it. Now she needed it. The question was how to get a message to him without the message being intercepted, without Pritchard knowing she was reaching out, and without tipping her hand to anyone she wasn't certain of. She walked past the stage line office. The stage ran twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. Today was Thursday. Too long to wait. She walked past the telegraph office and stopped. The telegraph office in Harlan's Crossing was operated by a man named Eli Mast, who was 23 years old and had come west from Ohio 2 years ago with the telegraph company, and had stayed because the Southwest agreed with his lungs, which had been unreliable back east, and because he had nowhere particular to be. He was slight, sandy-haired, and possessed of the low-level anxiety of someone who handles everyone else's communications and therefore knows a great deal about everyone and lives in a constant state of awareness about how many people would be very unhappy if he ever mentioned what he knew. He had never been rude to Wren. This was notable. It was the kind of notable thing that she filed under. Potential. The telegraph line ran through Harlan's Crossing, north to Albuquerque, south to El Paso. From Albuquerque, you could reach Santa Fe. The line had been up for 18 months. Pritchard, she knew, used it regularly. She also knew because she knew things that Mast was not employed by Pritchard. He was a company employee. Federal Telegraph Company, under contract to the territorial government. Theoretically, he could not be compelled to show his message logs to a private citizen. Theoretically. But theoretically was a thin wall between her and Pritchard's interest, and she needed something thicker. She went inside. Mast was at his equipment when she came in. He looked up, did the brief involuntary notation. Looked back down, she said, "Mr. Mast, Miss Birdthorn." Without looking up, "What can I do for you?" She had thought carefully about how to do this on the walk over. She had considered 3 approaches and rejected 2 of them, and was going with the third, which was the simplest, and which relied on something that she had assessed in Mast over 2 years, and believed she had correctly identified. She said, "I need to send a message, and I need it to be confidential." He looked up. She looked at him directly, not aggressively, not with the intensity that made people defensive, just directly, the way her father had taught her to look at people, when you needed them to understand that you were serious. "All messages are confidential," he said. "That's company policy." "I know," she said. "I need it to be actually confidential, not company policy confidential." He set down his pen. He looked at her more carefully now. She said, "The message is going to the Inspector General's office in Santa Fe, Callum Reed. I need it to Treacham and not Aldous Pritchard in that order." Very still. Mast. "Very still. You understand," he said, "that Mr. Pritchard is a significant—" "I understand," she said. "Can you send it?" Longer pause. "He can't compel me to show him messages," Mast said. "Legally. He has no—" "I know. He can make my situation here significantly more. I know that too." "Then why are you asking me?" She looked at him. She said, "Because you already know something is wrong here. You've known for a while. And knowing and not doing anything about it is a weight. I'm offering you a way to put it down." He stared at her. She waited. He picked up his pen. "What's the message?" he said. She kept it short, specific, the kind of message that could not be misread. "To Inspector General Callum Reed, Santa Fe. I hold a registered federal land deed, Manzano Mountains parcel, registration 1871, certified by Land Bureau Agent D. F. Grawl. Prospecting claim filed against same parcel 1876 by Pritchard Mining Company of Harlan's Crossing NM is void under federal land law. Holder is being threatened and coerced to surrender deed under duress. Request federal presence and legal authority within 4 days. Wren Birdthorn. Harlan's Crossing." She had him read it back to her. He read it back. She said, "Send it, and then forget I was here." He sent it. She left. 2 blocks from the telegraph office, she turned and looked back. Mast was standing in his doorway, watching her go. She held his gaze for a second. He nodded slightly, then went back inside. She turned and kept walking. One thing done. The second thing was harder, because the second thing required her to find out exactly what Pritchard knew. Not guessing, not assuming, knowing. Because the difference between what she thought Pritchard knew and what he actually knew was the difference between a plan that worked and a plan that collapsed at the moment she needed it most. She needed to know, did he know about Grawl? Did he know she'd been to the Land Records office? Did he know she'd spoken to Fitch? And she needed to know, most importantly, had he found out about the telegraph message? She had to assume the answer to most of those questions was yes. Pritchard was not a man who allowed information gaps. He had people in this town whose entire purpose was to ensure he did not have information gaps. She knew who most of them were, not because they were obvious they weren't. They had regular jobs, regular lives, regular positions in the social fabric of Harlan's Crossing. But she had been watching for 7 years, and she had noticed the patterns, the routes, the regular, casual meetings that were not casual, the ways in which certain people's awareness of certain things always seemed to flow upward toward the bank. She knew, for example, that Mrs. Calloway reported to Pritchard, not dramatically, not like a spy, just the way that a woman who had received a significant reduction on her store's loan terms in exchange for keeping certain eyes open did the minor, ongoing work of that arrangement. She mentioned things to her husband, who mentioned them to his Thursday lunch appointment with Bennett Shear, who mentioned them to the appropriate person at the bank. Mrs. Calloway had seen Wren leave her room this morning at dawn, had seen her go to the general store the front before opening hours, had noticed the oilskin cloth and the waxed thread in the purchase record, which she would have filed away without necessarily knowing what they meant, but which she would certainly have mentioned. So Pritchard knew she'd woken up early and bought waterproofing materials. He probably knew she'd been to the land records office because Pratt, not corrupt but not brave, had probably sent someone to tell Pritchard's people before Wren was 2 blocks away. He might know about Fitch, depending on whether Fitch had told him or whether he had someone watching Fitch's office. He probably didn't know about the telegraph. Mast was a careful man, and the office was on the north end of town, away from Pritchard's natural line of sight, but probably was not certainly. She needed more precision than probably. She went to find the one person in Harlan's Crossing who was connected to Pritchard's information network in a specific way and who had, she believed, a specific vulnerability she could work with. Bennett Shear, bank clerk, front desk, Thursday evenings at the brothel on Cutter Street, wife, 3 daughters on Maple Lane. Privy to Pritchard's administrative operations, in a way that the physical men, like Dole, were not. She found him at his lunch at the hotel dining room, which was where he ate every day, because Bennett Shear was a man of habits so rigid they were practically furniture. She sat down across from him. He looked up. He looked around. He looked back at her. "Miss Birdthorne," he said, in the voice of a man who was trying to determine whether this was a coincidence or an ambush and was leaning toward the latter. "Mr. Shear," she said pleasantly. "I'll be brief. He glanced at the door. "I don't think this is—" "I know about Thursday evenings," she said. He went white. "I know," she said. "You know that I know, and you know that I have never mentioned it to anyone, which is something I've chosen to do for 7 years. I want you to understand that I'm not threatening you. What I'm doing is establishing that we have an existing arrangement, a small one, an informal one, but it exists of mutual discretion." He was looking at his plate, not eating. "What do you want?" he said very quietly. "What does Pritchard know?" she said. "Right now. Today. What has he been told?" Shear didn't say anything. She waited. "He knows you were at the land records office," Shear said finally, still looking at his plate. "Pratt sent word an hour after you left. He knows you have a federal deed and a certified copy. Does he know about the telegraph?" Shear looked up. "The telegraph?" She read his face. No. He didn't know. Which meant Pritchard didn't know. "What else?" she said. "He knows about Grawl." Shear's voice was flat, reciting. The voice of a man who has decided that if he is going to do something compromising, he is going to do it efficiently. He knows who he is, what he did, the signature. How? He's had there are people in the Las Cruces Land Bureau still. From that time. Connections. He set his fork down. He's been tracking Grawl for 2 years, since he figured out that the deed might actually be real. 2 years. Pritchard had known the deed existed for 2 years and had been waiting for it to surface. "What's his plan?" she said. "I don't, Mr. Shear." He looked at her. "His plan," he said, "was to get your signature on the transfer paper and have it done quietly. Make it look like a voluntary sale. That was the plan. And now that I didn't sign?" Shear picked up his fork. "Put it down again. He'll move to discredit the deed. Say it's fraudulent. He has people who can produce documentation that says the deed was never properly registered, that the original filing was irregular. It wasn't." "No," Shear said quietly. "It wasn't. But he can make it look like it was. If Grawl can't testify, or if the certified copy can't be produced." She looked at him. "He's going to try to take the deed," she said. "He's going to try to take the deed," Shear confirmed. "Or the copy. Or both. Tonight, I think. Shear's jaw worked. "He's not patient anymore. He's been patient for 2 years, and he's done with patience." She stood up. "Miss Birdthorne," Shear said. She looked at him. "I'm not a bad man," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I believe you," she said, "but I think you should decide what that means before tonight." She walked out. Not a bad man. She thought about that as she moved quickly through the midday streets. Not a bad man. Just a man who had made one compromise, which had required another compromise, which had made the third one easier. And now here he was, telling a woman he'd helped put in danger that he wasn't a bad man. She didn't have contempt for him. She understood it. She had spent 7 years making her own compromises. Smaller ones, maybe, less consequential. But the same basic structure. I will accept this limitation, because the alternative is a confrontation I don't believe I can survive. The difference between her and Shear was not that she was braver. The difference was that her compromise had been waiting for her. the envelope, the sealed wax. When there is no other choice, her father had not given her a choice about when to make her stand. He had made the choice for her, from the grave, with a precision that she was still marveling at even now. When you have no other option, that's when. Not a second before, because before that you're not ready. And not a second after, because after that it's too late. She was in that moment right now. She could feel it, the clarifying terror of it. She went back to Grawl. He was still at the livery. Or rather, he'd gone somewhere and come back, because the roan horse had been brushed and watered and was now in the stall with hay, and Grawl was sitting on a hay bale outside the stall, with his colt broken down on a cloth on his knee, cleaning it with the focused attention of someone who was doing something methodical so that their mind could work on something else. She came in. He looked up. She said, "He's going to move tonight." "Who told you?" "Shear. Shear. He absorbed this." "You went to Shear?" "Yes. That was—" He started to say something and stopped. "Risky," she said. "I know. It was also faster than anything else I had. And Shear is not going to tell Pritchard, because he'd have to explain what he told me and why, and that's not a conversation he wants to have." Grawl looked at her for a moment. "Were they?" he said. "Were they what?" "Reckless. The decisions that looked reckless." He thought about it. "No, they were fast. There's a difference." She sat down on the stall railing across from him. She said, "I sent a message to the Inspector General in Santa Fe. Reed." He paused mid-reassembly. "Reed," he said slowly. "Yes. You know Reed?" "I know his name." "How?" She thought about the Widow Drummond's letter on the table. "I read a lot," she said. He looked at her, seemed to decide that pressing this point was not productive. Went back to the colt. "Reed is if Reed responds, and if he comes, and if he gets here before Pritchard. 4 days," she said. "I asked for federal presence in 4 days. That's tight. Which is why tonight matters." He clicked the colt back together. "What happens tonight?" "He's going to try to take the deed. Or the copy, or both." She looked at Grawl, "Which means I can't have them on me when he tries." Grawl looked at her. She said, "I need to put them somewhere he won't look. And put something on you that looks like what he's looking for." "Yes." A pause. "He'll know it's not real," Grawl said. "When he looks at it." "It doesn't need to fool him for long," Wren said. "It just needs to be in his hands while the real one is somewhere else, Asef." Grawl thought about this. "Where?" he said. "Where do you put the real one?" She had been thinking about this since she left Shear. She said, "Fitch." Grawl went very quiet for a moment. "Then Fitch. He's already compromised on this matter because of the conflict of interest. He can't represent Pritchard in anything involving my deed, which means Pritchard can't use him to go after the deed legally. He could use him other ways." "Fitch won't," she said. "He's not a brave man, but he's a meticulous man. And my father told him something prepared him for this in some way, and he's been sitting on it for 5 years. He's ready to be useful. I could see it on him. You saw it on him in one conversation. I've been watching people in this town for 7 years." Grawl looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition not of who she was, but of what she was. He said, "All right, Fitch. I go to Fitch this afternoon," she said. "Give him the original and the certified copy. He holds them in his office. His records are professionally confidential. Pritchard can't compel him to produce them without a court order, and getting a court order takes time. Time Pritchard doesn't have," Grawl said. "If your telegraph message actually reaches Reed and Reed actually responds." "Right. That's a lot of conditionals." "Yes. What if Reed doesn't come?" She looked at him. She said, "Then we figure out the next thing." Which was not really an answer, but it was the only honest one she had, and he seemed to understand that. She went to Fitch at 1 in the afternoon. She did not knock. She tried the door. It was unlocked. She went in. Fitch was at his desk. He looked up. He did not look surprised. He said, "Shear." "No," she said. "I just assumed you'd be ready." He looked at her for a moment. "He's going to move tonight," she said. "Yes," Fitch said. "He told me this morning." "Indirectly. He never says things directly." He folded his hands on the desk. "He told me that the situation with the Birdthorn matter was going to be resolved tonight, and that I should be prepared to process a voluntary deed transfer first thing tomorrow morning. And I told him that I'd have the paperwork ready." He looked at her steadily. "Which I will, if it comes to that, which I'm hoping it won't." She studied him. She said, "How long have you been waiting for this?" "Since your father came to see me in 1873, he said. 5 years. What did he tell you? Fitch looked at his desk for a moment. He told me the truth about what was on the land, about what Pritchard was going to try to do, about the deed. He looked up. He asked me very specifically, your father. He asked me to remember that the deed was real, that if the day came when someone contested its legitimacy, I had personal, direct knowledge that it was valid, that I'd spoken to the agent who certified it. He paused. He asked me to be a witness. And you said yes. I said I would try, Fitch said, which is the most I could honestly say given my situation. Can you do more than try now? He looked at her. He said, what are you asking me to hold? She reached inside her dress and removed the oilskin-wrapped documents. She set them on his desk. He looked at them. He looked at her. Both, he said. Original and certified copy? Yes. And if Pritchard, he can't compel you to produce them, she said. Your records are confidential. I'm a client you've never paid me, he said. She looked at him. He picked up the documents. He opened his desk drawer. He put the documents inside. He locked the drawer. He put the key in his vest pocket. You're a client, he said. Pro bono. She nodded. She stood up. Miss Birdthorne, Fitch said. She waited. When this is over, he said, whatever direction it goes, I want you to know that your father was the most honest man I ever dealt with in a professional capacity, and that I've thought about the fact that I couldn't protect him every day for 5 years. She held his gaze. Then help me now, she said. That's how you protect him. She left. She went back to her room. She did 3 things. First, she took a piece of paper, ordinary paper, the kind she used for recording laundry orders, and wrote on it, in careful imitation of official language, something that looked superficially like a land deed, vague enough that it wouldn't fool a close examination, specific enough that it might, in dim light and under pressure, create a moment of doubt. That was all she needed it to do. Create a moment. Second, she loaded the Remington. Full cylinder. 6 rounds of 0.44 center fire. She checked the action, checked the barrel, checked the cylinder. Good. Clean. She reholstered it in the inside rig. Third, she sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the chest. Empty now, or nearly. The lock was still good. The chest itself was where anyone looking for something would look first, which was exactly the point. She put the fake document in the chest, locked it. She breathed. She was going to sit here now, in this room, and she was going to wait, and she was not going to do anything else until it was necessary to do something else, because she was at the point in a situation like this where the error that destroyed you was the error of moving when you should be still, of acting when the action you needed to take was patience, which was the hardest action of all, because it felt like nothing. It was not nothing. It was everything. She waited. 3 hours. She sat on the cot and listened to the town outside. The sounds of Harlan's Crossing in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Wagons. The distant hammer from the smithy. The dogs that lived behind the hotel barking at something. The stage which had come from the south and was being unloaded at the stage office, half a block away. She heard at some point footsteps in the passage outside her room. Not Mrs. Calloway's knock. Slower. Deliberate. Like someone checking. Like someone establishing that she was in there. She stayed still. The footsteps moved on. She thought about her father. Not deliberately. He just arrived in her mind the way he did sometimes, not the grief of him, not the loss, but the actual specific presence of him, the way he had been. The quality of his attention when he was working through a problem. He had a habit of tapping his thumbnail against his front teeth, very lightly, a sound that was barely audible, that she had learned to recognize as the sound of him arriving at something. She wished she could hear it now. She thought instead about what he had done. He had known they were coming. He had been afraid in the careful way that careful men are afraid. He had not run. He had not surrendered. He had prepared. He had filed the deed in her name. He had spoken to Fitch. He had written the letter. He had taught her to shoot when she was a child, patient and specific, making sure she understood each step. And she had not understood until now, sitting on this cot in this room with the Remington against her ribs, that the shooting lesson was not actually about shooting. It was about the other thing. The thing that every shooting lesson was actually about, underneath the mechanics of it. It was about the knowledge that you could defend yourself. Not that you would. Not even that you should. Just that you could. That you had the capacity, and the capacity was yours, and no one could take it from you. He had put that in her. Quietly. Specifically. He had made sure she knew she had it. And then he had left her a problem to solve that required her to use it. She pressed her hand against her side, over the Remington. She breathed. She waited. They came at 2 in the morning. She'd expected midnight. Midnight was what she would have chosen deep enough into the night that even the saloon was quiet, the streets empty. But Pritchard was not her, and he had apparently decided that 2 was better, when even the people who stayed up late had given up. He almost got it right. She heard them in the passage. Not the same single set of footsteps from the afternoon. Multiple. 3, she estimated. Trying to be quiet and not quite achieving it. Because quiet at 2 in the morning in a wooden building is harder than it sounds. She was already to be standing. She'd been standing for 20 minutes, the Remington in her hand, the thumb of her free hand resting lightly on the hammer. The door came open, fast. Not kicked, that was a surprise. One of them had the skills to work a lock, which meant Pritchard had thought about this more carefully than she'd given him credit for. 3 men. She'd been right. Dole was one. She didn't know the other 2. They were carrying a lantern, turned low, just enough light to work by. Dole looked at her. She looked at him. She had the Remington up. He stopped. The 2 men behind him stopped. He said, "Miss Birdthorne, put that down," she said. "No, nobody needs to get—" "The deed isn't here," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You came for the deed," she said. "It's not here." "I moved it this afternoon." Dole's jaw worked. "The chest," he said. "Check it," she said. "The lock's yours." He looked at the man to his left, gestured toward the chest. The man went to the chest, had a pick of his own, a different one from the door, smaller, worked the lock, opened the chest, found the fake document, brought it to Dole. Dole looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that she could see him parsing it, working through the language, realizing what she'd done. His face did not become angry. It became something colder. "Clever," he said. "I've had time to think about things." "Where is it?" "Somewhere you're not going to find it," she said. "And I want you to hear this part clearly. Mr. Dole, by tomorrow afternoon, there's going to be a federal official involved in this. Who's been contacted? Who knows this deed exists? Who knows that I hold it? And who knows that Pritchard's claim is void?" She kept her voice even. Not aggressive, just factual. Which means that even if you find the deed and destroy it, the record is already in motion. You can't unmake that. Dole was very still. "Mr. Pritchard," he started, "is making a mistake," she said. "And I think you know it. And I think you've known it for a while. Because you're not a stupid man. And the reason you came here tonight with a lockpick instead of a rifle is because you understand that the line between what you've been doing and what you'd be doing if you pushed this is the kind of line that, once you cross it, you're across forever." The lantern in Dole's hand was very still. "You should go," she said. "Tell him the deed isn't here. Tell him what I told you about the federal contact, and let him decide how to proceed." Long pause. Very long. "You understand," Dole said finally, "that if he decides to proceed, then we'll have a different conversation," she said. "But that'll be his decision, not yours." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he turned and went out. The other 2 followed. The door was open. The passage was empty. The lantern light moved away down the passage and disappeared. She stood in the dark, the Remington still up. She waited. She counted to 60. Nothing. She lowered the Remington. Her hands were shaking. Both of them. She sat down on the cot. She had not allowed herself to register in the moment. How afraid she was. That was the practice. You put the fear somewhere it could not affect your function, and you did the function, and afterward you picked the fear back up, and you let yourself feel it. She felt it now. Her whole body. The shaking moving through her in one long wave, and then subsiding. She put the Remington on the chest. She lay back on the cot. She breathed. She was all right. It was fine. She was all right. And then she was asleep before she'd finished deciding whether she was. Friday morning came gray and cold. Wind had picked up overnight, coming down hard off the Manzanos, the way it did in late October, carrying something from the high peaks, something thin and sharp and uncompromising. The altitude and the stone compressed into weather. She woke at 5, which was later than usual. She lay still for a moment, running through the inventory. Deed with Fitch, locked drawer. Telegraph message sent 2 days ago. Maybe reaching Santa Fe yesterday. Fake document in Dole's pocket, presumably. Or back with Pritchard, who would now know with certainty that she'd anticipated him. And now came the part she hadn't fully solved yet. She knew what she needed. She needed Reed to come, or send someone who could compel Pritchard to bring his void prospecting claim into a legal proceeding where it would not survive scrutiny. She needed that to happen before Pritchard decided that the law was not going to serve him and moved to something else. She didn't know what that something else was, but she knew from 7 years of watching that men like Pritchard had a limit. When the process stopped working, when the leverage ran out, when the position became untenable, they went somewhere older. Somewhere that predated courts and deeds and certified copies and the entire elaborate structure of law that men like Pritchard used as a tool when it suited them and discarded when it didn't. She had bought time. But she was run short of it. She got up. She went to find Grawl. He was not at the livery. She checked his room at the boarding house. The landlady told her flatly that he'd gone out before dawn, and she didn't know where. Wren walked the town. It was early. The main street was quiet. A few horses at rails, the general store just opening. The smell of breakfast fires from the houses on the residential streets behind the commercial blocks. She found him at the north end of town. Standing at the edge of the road that went north to Albuquerque, he was just standing there in the gray morning, looking north. His Winchester was in his left hand, stock resting on the ground. She came up beside him. He said, without looking at her, "Did they come?" "Yes. And the deed wasn't there. They found the fake. I told them about the telegraph message." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a risk," he said. "Telling them. It was a larger risk to let Pritchard think he still had options." He looked north. "How'd it go? The three of them in your room at 2 in the morning?" She thought about it. "My hands shook," she said. "Afterward." He nodded slowly, like this was the right answer to give. "Dull," he said. He could have pushed. "He's not ready to cross that line." "How'd you know?" She thought about what she'd said to Dole. The line that, once you cross it, you're across forever. "He checked the door lock before he opened it," she said. "A man who is ready to cross the line doesn't check the door lock. He kicks it in." Grawl looked at her. She looked north with him for a moment. She said, "How long for a response?" "From Santa Fe." "Reed," Grawl said. He was thinking if the message reached him yesterday, if he was in office, if he shook his head, he'd have to verify. Talk to his people. Arrange travel. He paused. 3 days. Maybe 4. Minimum. I gave him 4. Then we need to hold for 4 days. Pritchard is not going to give us 4 days. No, Grawl said. He's not. They both looked north. The road was empty, long and straight and pale against the brown-gray landscape, disappearing over a slight rise about a mile out. Nothing coming. Not yet. "What does Pritchard do now?" she said. Grawl was quiet for a long time. "He's going to try to make the deed irrelevant," he said finally. She looked at him. "Not take it," he said. "Make it not matter. If he can discredit me, if he can produce documents suggesting the certification was fraudulent, that I exceeded my authority, that the registration was improper, then the deed itself doesn't hold up. It becomes a disputed document in a territorial court instead of a clear federal title. Can he do that?" "He has people in the Land Bureau still," Grawl said. "I told you that. He's been working toward this for 2 years. He's probably already prepared something." She thought about Scheer at his lunch table. "He'll move to discredit the deed. If Grawl can't testify, that's why she said. You're the piece he needs to neutralize. If you're not available to testify to the legitimacy of the registration, then the deed is much easier to contest." She looked at him. He was still looking north. She said, "He's going to come after you." "Yes," he said. "Probably today." She said, "Then we don't let him." "How?" She turned and looked at the town. The main street, the buildings, the church on the corner, the bank, with its second-floor window where Pritchard stood every morning. "I've been invisible for 7 years," she said. "I know every building in this town, every back way, every place where a man could be that no one would look." He looked at her. "You're suggesting I hide," he said. "I'm suggesting you be somewhere. Pritchard's people can't find you quickly," she said. "For 4 days. And that I hold the line here while you do." He was quiet then. "And if 4 days comes and Reed doesn't?" She looked at him. She said, "Then I think of the next thing." He almost smiled. "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning it," she said. She took him to the water tower. The water tower on the south end of Harlan's Crossing was the property of the mining company that had put it up 3 years ago. and then run out of money before they built the mine they'd theoretically needed the water for. It stood at the edge of town on a lot that nobody owned and nobody used, 60 feet of creosoted timber, and a tank that was more than half full, and a small maintenance platform at the top that had a view of most of the town and all of the southern road. More relevantly, it had a storage space at the base, a locked room that held equipment, rope and tools and repair timber. Wren had the key because she had, 2 years ago, done laundry for the mining company foreman before he left town. And he had left the key with her for reasons she had never fully understood, and had simply accepted because that was what you did with unexpected assets. She let Grawl in, showed him the space, the cot that the overnight watchman had used, and apparently left behind, the stove that still worked, the water above them. She said, "Can you stay here?" He looked around. "How long?" 4 days. Possibly more. "What happens if Pritchard's men come?" She looked at him. He had the Winchester. He had the Colt. He understood the question she was answering without saying. "All right," he said. She said. 4 days, she said. "I'll bring food." "Don't make it regular," he said. "Different times. Different routes. Don't let it become a pattern." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know you know," he said. She turned to go. "Wren." She stopped. He said, "Your father. When he came to me in 1870 to show me the land and the survey notes, he brought you with him. You were," he thought, "12, maybe 13. She turned. "You sat in the corner of the survey office," he said, "and you read every document on the desk. Everyone. And when we were done, and your father asked if you had any questions, you said, 'The boundary markers on the north end, how precise are they? Because if they're imprecise, someone could challenge the corners.' You were 12. She said nothing. "He looked at me," Grawl said, "like I was supposed to see something. And I did see it. He shook his head. "I didn't understand what it meant then." "What do you understand now?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "That he was preparing you," he said, "for all of it. Not just the deed. Not just the land. He was building you into someone who could handle this." She was quiet, he said. "He knew he wasn't going to be here for it. He knew that. And he was making sure you would be enough without him." She looked at her hands. She said, very quietly, "I'm going to go get you some food." She went out. She didn't let herself feel it until she was 3 blocks away and in an alley where no one could see her. And then she stood with her back against the adobe wall, and she looked up at the gray sky, and she let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The weight of 7 years. The weight of a father who had known. The weight of being made into something by someone who loved you. Without your knowledge. Without your consent. Quietly. Carefully. Because they could see what you were going to need, and they couldn't stop what was coming. And so they gave you what they could. 30 seconds. Then she straightened up, smoothed her dress, walked back out into the street. She had things to do. Friday passed. Saturday. She moved through her days as close to normally as she could manage. Collected the laundry. Delivered it. Worked the needle and thread in the window light. Nodded to Mrs. Calloway. Did not make eye contact with Bennett Shear when she passed the bank. Did not look at Pritchard's window. She brought food to Grawl at the water tower, different times, different routes, the same way she'd avoided being noticed in this town, for 7 years. The same machinery, now put to a different purpose. She watched, she waited. She watched Pritchard's men move through town. There were more of them visible now. Dole, and the 2 men from the other night, and 3 others she didn't fully recognize. They were looking for Grawl. She could read it in their patterns. The way they checked the livery, the boarding house, the saloon at different hours. Methodical. Systematic. Not finding him. She tracked their search the way you track something that might eventually turn towards you. Not yet. They were still in the phase of looking where he should be. They hadn't started looking where he shouldn't be. That would come. She had to be ready. The Remington was not a comfortable gun to carry. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for function, for stopping what needed to be stopped, for saying what words could not say, for being present in a situation the way that only a certain kind of object can be present, with a weight that is both physical and moral, a weight that reminds you constantly of what it represents. She had carried it for 7 years. Not always on her person, she was not reckless about this. There were days, most days, when the Remington stayed in the chest, locked, because she was going about the work of a laundress and a seamstress, and there was no call for it, and carrying it would have been a kind of theater she had no interest in. But on the days when something felt different when she woke up, and the quality of the air was wrong, when she came out of her room in the morning, and the town had a particular stillness that wasn't the stillness of ordinary morning. On those days it went inside her coat in the rig she'd made herself, and she went about her work, and nobody knew. This was one of those days. Had been since before dawn. She had known it when she woke up, before she counted the inventory, before she dressed, the moment her eyes opened and the dark was the particular shade of dark it gets, right before it changes. She had known. Something in the air of the town was different. Something in the specific silence had a texture it didn't usually have. So the Remington was with her, and Devereaux Grawl was in a storage room at the base of the water tower, waiting, and she was walking through Harlan's Crossing, trying to look like a woman who was simply going about her business, which was, she reflected, not entirely unlike simply going about her business, because the external behaviors were identical, the same route, the same pace, the same head position. But internally, she was running approximately 12 parallel processes simultaneously, tracking the town and Pritchard's people and the position of the sun and the time she needed before Reed could possibly arrive, and the state of the deed in its oilskin casing against her skin, and whether Fitch had moved it yet, and whether Mast's telegraph log was secure, and whether Shear was going to hold, or whether he was going to fold and tell Pritchard what he'd told her. She breathed. One thing at a time. That had been her father's other lesson. The one he hadn't put in the envelope, because it wasn't the kind of thing that fit in an envelope. The kind of thing that got transmitted through, watching someone operate under pressure, over years. The kind of thing that was more education than instruction. One thing at a time. Not because the other things weren't there. They were there. All of them. All 12 parallel processes running. But the one you acted on was the one in front of you right now, and the others waited their turn. And if you maintained the discipline of that sequence, this thing, then that thing, then the next, you could move through a complicated situation without being paralyzed by its complexity. One thing at a time. Right now the thing was Fitch. She pushed open the door to his office without knocking. He looked up. The deed, she said. He opened the false bottom. One thing done. She walked out into the morning and moved to the next thing. The water tower. Grawl. She let herself in with the key always in her left coat pocket. Always the same pocket. Because if you put something in different places, you spend time looking for it. And time was something she was conserving with the precision of a woman who knows exactly how little of it she has. And the door swung open on the storage space with its smell of old wood and machine oil, and the cold that had settled in overnight, the specific cold of an enclosed space in October that the small stove had been battling but not winning. Grawl was standing. He'd heard her coming, of course. She'd made a specific amount of noise on purpose, not silence. Because silence from outside a door you're expecting to have opened by a specific person, and instead, finding you've made no noise, is alarming. And alarmed people with guns make errors. She'd made the right amount of noise. The sound of someone who knows where they're going and has every right to be going there. He had the Colt in his hand when the door opened. He put it away when he saw her. She noted this. Not the reaching for the gun that was reflex, that was appropriate. That was a man who had survived long enough to have good instincts. What she noted was the speed of the put-away, the absence of the territorial display. No extended moment of keeping the gun visible while he assessed whether she was actually safe. Just, threat identified as not a threat. Gun away, continue. It was a small thing. It told her something. She told him about Reed. She told him about the injunction. She watched him process both pieces of information with the same quality of attention, not more excited about the good news, not more concerned about the bad news, just receiving information and filing it and adjusting his internal map of the situation accordingly. Her father had done that. She had done that. She had not, before this week, met anyone else who did it. She said, 2 more days. He said, 2 more days. They looked at each other. I built witnesses yesterday, she said. He almost smiled. I know, he said. I could hear it. She raised an eyebrow. From up here, he said. You can see most of the main street. I watched you go into every business. I watched them watch you leave. He paused. Some of them went to their windows afterward and looked at the bank. She hadn't known that. She filed it. They're thinking, she said. Yes. Good. Yes, he said again. And then, after a moment, your father would have done the same thing. Exactly the same thing, the sequence of it. Start with the people who are already watching. Give them something specific to watch for. Let them make their own calculations, she said. He wasn't perfect at it. Grawl looked at her. He missed something, she said. Somewhere. Someone. Something he didn't prepare for. Because if he'd prepared for everything, she stopped. He was quiet. He'd still be here, she said. Very quietly. Yes, Grawl said. He would. They sat with that for a moment. Not grief. Exactly. Something adjacent to it. The specific weight of an absence that has had 7 years to become familiar, to become structural, to become part of the architecture of how you move through the world, and then periodically, to make itself felt again with the fresh force of something new. She had learned to hold that, she breathed. 2 more days, she said. She went out. The town in the afternoon had a different texture than the town in the morning. In the morning, Harlan's Crossing was functional, purposeful. People going where they were going, doing what they were doing, the machinery of commerce and daily life running with the efficiency of long practice. In the afternoon, especially in October, when the light changed and the wind came down off the mountains with a certain authority, the town got something else, something more reflective. Men stood in doorways and looked at the street. Women sat in front windows and watched the light. The saloon began to fill. It was in this afternoon texture that things happened. Not the big things those happened in the dark, in lanes at 2 in the morning, but the intermediate things, the conversations, the calculations, the slow realignment of positions that happened in a town. Whenever a town felt something shifting, she had spent Tuesday morning forcing a shift. Now she was watching to see what it produced. She walked past the general store. Mrs. Calloway was at the window. Their eyes met through the glass. Wren looked away first, deliberately not submission. Just refusal to make it a contest. She had nothing to prove to Mrs. Calloway, and no interest in establishing dominance over a woman who reported to Pritchard and would continue to report to Pritchard, regardless of what happened this week, because the loan terms on the Calloway store were not going to change based on Wren's situation. She walked on. Shear was not visible. The bank's front windows showed the interior desks, papers, the teller's window, but Shear's desk was toward the back, and she couldn't see it from the street. She didn't try to see it. She had gotten from Shear what she needed. Pressing for more would alert Pritchard that she'd used him, which might cause Shear to do something unpredictable in self-protection, which was a variable she didn't need. She walked on, the telegraph office. Mast was visible through his window, at his equipment, his back to the street. He did not look up as she passed. She kept walking. That was the practice. That was the discipline. Move. Watch. Do not linger. Do not give anyone a specific reason to note your location or direction, because specific reasons traveled through this town at a speed that would have impressed the telegraph itself. She circled back through the alley behind the main street. The alley was her domain. Had been for 7 years. The back side of Harlan's Crossing, the part that faced away from the public, the part where the garbage collected and the delivery wagons came, and the cats hunted whatever the garbage produced. She knew every inch of it. Every fence, every gate, every gap between buildings, every place where you could stand in shadow and see without being seen. She checked the water tower from a distance. No activity around it, no one watching it. Pritchard's men were still focused on the visible spaces, the livery, the boarding house, the saloon, still looking where Grawl should be rather than where he was. That would change. Methodical people, when they've exhausted the obvious places, moved to the less obvious ones. She calculated maybe 1 more day before their search pattern expanded enough to bring them within range of the water tower's storage room. 1 more day, which was fine, because tomorrow was Wednesday, and Wednesday was Reed. She breathed the cold alley air and felt, for the first time in days, something that was not quite calm but was adjacent to it. The specific quality of a person who has made all the preparations that can be made and is now simply waiting for the thing to arrive. Readiness. Not peace. Readiness. She went back to her room and picked up the mending and kept working until the light went, and then lit the lamp and kept working, until she couldn't keep her eyes open. And then she lay down on the cot, in her clothes, with the Remington on the floor beside her, and she was asleep in approximately 2 minutes. She did not dream. Or if she dreamed, she did not remember it. She woke at 4:15. She assessed. She counted. She got up. She went to work. The thing about the night Dole and his men had come, the thing she had not said to Grawl when he asked how it went, was that she had been talking the whole time. Not out loud. Inside. There was a version of herself that ran alongside her, in moments of danger, a commentary track, analytical and sometimes surprisingly calm, that processed what was happening and offered assessments, and occasionally said things that surprised her. When the door opened and the three men came in, the commentary had said, 3. Expected 3. The lamp is low. Good. Low light favors the person who knows the room. When Dole looked at the chest, it had said he'll check it. He has to check it. Let him check it. When she told Dole about the federal official, it had said, watch his hands. His hands will tell you whether this lands. His hands on the lantern had gone very still. That was when she had known that he would go, that he would not push, that the line he had drawn for himself was somewhere behind where she was standing, and that crossing it in a room where the person he was crossing it against was holding a gun she clearly knew how to use, in a situation where a federal official was reportedly already in motion, was a step he was not willing to take. She had known, in that moment, with the clarity that comes when your entire attention is focused on one thing and everything irrelevant falls away. She had known that he would go, and he had gone, and then she had lowered the Remington and sat down and her hands had shaken. Because knowing a thing and experiencing a thing are different animals. She knew she was right. She was still afraid. Both of those were true. Both of them could be true at the same time. Her father had taught her that too. Not in words. In the way he had said once, when she had watched him refuse to reclassify a parcel in the face of significant pressure from a man who had made it clear the pressure would only increase, I'm afraid every time I do this. And I do it anyway. Because the doing it is the point. The fear is just the price of admission. The fee of admission. She had turned that phrase over in her mind for years. The fear is just the price of admission. Admission to what, she had wondered when she was young. Now she understood. To being the person who acts when acting is necessary. To being the kind of person she was, which was the same person her father had been. Which was, she was beginning to understand. Not a coincidence. The night before Reed came, she could not sleep. She lay on the cot in the dark, and she catalogued the things she had done, and the things she had left undone, and the things she could not control and the things she could, and she found, at the end of the catalog, that the proportions were about as good as she could have made them. The deed was with Fitch. The telegraph message had been confirmed. The witnesses had been built. Grawl was safe. The fake document had bought her the night she needed. The investigation of the Las Cruces records was in motion. She had told Pritchard to his face, in front of his man, that she'd contacted federal authorities. She had said what needed to be said. She had done what needed to be done. The rest was not hers to control. That was the hardest part. Not the confrontations, not the fear, not even the long solitude of 7 years in a town that refused to see her. The hardest part was the part where you had done everything you could do, and you had to trust that it was enough, that the pieces you'd put in motion would move the way you'd calculated, that the people you'd relied on would hold, that the man riding from Santa Fe through the night on her behalf would arrive. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the town breathe. October, in Harlan's Crossing, had a particular sound. Not quiet nowhere with people in it was quiet. Not really. Not even at 3 in the morning. But a specific quality of sound, a diminished and muffled kind of sound. The sound of a place pulling inward against the cold, buttoning up, finding its edges. She had listened to this sound for 7 years, and she had thought, every October, that she would listen to it from somewhere else. The following October, that she would have found what she was looking for and could move on. Could go north, could go west, could find a version of a life that was hers rather than this borrowed, provisional, invisible version. She had not gone north. She had not gone west. She had stayed. Because the truth was here, and the truth was almost within reach. She breathed the cold room air. The mountains were out there in the dark. 480 acres. Her grandfather's ground. She was going to stand on it. She was going to stand on it tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that, and she was going to feel the rock under her feet, and she was going to say his name, her grandfather's name, which she knew because her mother had told her, and her mother's voice was a thing she still had. perfectly preserved in the unrevised filing system of her memory, and she was going to stand there and not be invisible, not hidden, not a ghost, not the girl no one saw, just herself. On her own ground, she breathed. She waited for dawn. Sunday morning, the church bell rang. She was not in church. She sat in her room in the morning light and listened to the bell and thought about the structure of the situation and where the weak points were. She had two active variables. One, Reed's response. Coming or not coming? She did not know. She would not know until it arrived, or it didn't. That was not in her control, and she had put it out of her mind as much as possible. Two, Pritchard's next move. She had been watching Pritchard for 7 years. She had a detailed map of how he thought, the logic of it, the progression from one approach to the next. When an approach stopped working, he had tried coercion the lane. The offer of $200 failed. He had tried direct action, the night visit to her room, failed. And now he knew the deed was with someone he couldn't easily reach. He was going to try something different. She was trying to figure out what. She thought about what Grawl had said. Make the deed irrelevant. Discredit the certification. She thought about Shear's summary. Produce documentation, suggesting the filing was irregular. She thought about the timeline. Grawl had been removed from his position in 1874. That was 4 years ago. 4 years was long enough to construct a narrative, produce paper that looked like paper, to build in the files of the Las Cruces Bureau a record of irregularity. If Pritchard produced that, if he walked into any proceeding with fabricated documentation of fraud in the certification, Grawl's testimony became contested, the deed became contested, and in contested situations, the person with more resources and more connections to the territorial legal apparatus won. She needed to preempt that, but she couldn't do it from Harlan's Crossing. She needed someone in Las Cruces who could tell her whether the Bureau records had been tampered with, who could look at the certification record and say whether it was intact. She didn't have anyone in Las Cruces. She sat with this problem for a while, she thought. She thought about the specific, practical limitations of her situation. No connections in Las Cruces. No money for travel. No ability to leave Harlan's Crossing without Pritchard knowing. No, she stopped. She thought about Fitch. Fitch had connections. Fitch had handled land transactions across the territory for 15 years. Fitch had clients in Las Cruces. He was a lawyer. He had professional relationships with other lawyers, with land officers, with court clerks. And Fitch was currently, because of the conflict of interest in her matter, in a position where his professional obligation was to her. She went to find Fitch. He was in his office. He was always in his office on Sunday mornings. She had observed this. She knocked. He let her in. She said, I need someone to check the Las Cruces Land Bureau records. The original Birdthorn certification file. I need to know if it's been altered. He looked at her. Altered, he said. Pritchard has people there still. He's been building a narrative for 2 years. I need to know what narrative he's built before I find out in a proceeding. Fitch thought. I know a man, he said. In Las Cruces, retired court clerk. He was there in 1871 when the certification was filed. He has access to records. He'd know if something had been changed. He paused. I can write to him. Faster than writing, she said. Can you telegraph him? I don't know if he's on a telegraph line. Find out. He looked at her for a moment. He stopped. Efficient, she said. I was going to say prepared. I had a good teacher, she said. He went to his desk and wrote a name and address on a piece of paper and handed it to her. Aubrey Park, he said. Former clerk. Dona Ana County Courthouse. If he's reachable, he'll know. She took the paper. She said, if I find out Pritchard has planted something in those records, what do we do? Fitch looked at the locked drawer. If the certification record has been altered, he said carefully, and if Grawl can testify that the original was correct, and if there's a federal official present who can compel the production of the altered record alongside Grawl's testimony, he spread his hands. Then Pritchard has not just an invalid claim. He has evidence of federal records tampering, which is a federal crime, Fitch said, a significant one. She stood. Write to Park, she said. Today. Before Pritchard's people figure out that you're the one holding the deed and start paying more attention to your communications. He reached for his pen. She left. She went back to Mast. He was in the telegraph office. He looked up when she came in. He looked, for the first time in 2 years of her knowing him, like he had not had a good night's sleep, or several good night's sleeps. She said, "Is there any response from Santa Fe?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "I need to send another message," he said. "Who to?" She gave him the name. Aubrey Park. The address in Las Cruces. She told him what to put in it. He looked at her. He said, "You're building something." She said, "Yes," he said. "What happens if it doesn't hold together?" She said. "Then I figure out the next thing." He looked at her for a long time. Then he sent the message. Sunday afternoon. She was back in her room. She was at the window. Actually sewing. The Drummond curtains. Because the work did not stop being real. Just because other things were also real when she heard it. Voices in the passage. More than one. Moving fast. Not trying to be quiet. She put down the curtains. She put her hand on the Remington. The knock was hard. Not Mrs. Calloway's rhythm. Not a polite knock. She said, "Who is it?" Dole's voice. "Open the door, Miss Birdthorne." "Mr. Pritchard wants to speak with you," she said. Then Mr. Pritchard can come speak with me." Pause. A longer one than she'd expected. Then a different voice, older. Controlled. The voice of a man who had spent decades making people feel that his voice was the sound of order itself. Aldous Pritchard said, "Miss Birdthorne, it's Sunday. I thought we might have a conversation without any further unpleasantness." She stood with her hand on the Remington for a moment. Then she opened the door. She had seen Pritchard before. Of course she had. 7 years in his town. You didn't avoid seeing the man who ran everything. But she had never been in a room with him. Never been the direct object of his attention. He was 60-something. Well-built, well-dressed, not ostentatiously, but with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was a tool and kept his tools in good condition. Silver hair. Blue eyes. The kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had become, with age, something more useful than handsome. He looked at her the way she had seen him look at the mountains from his window. Quiet. Precise. Like something that had been placed in a position on a board and now needed to be dealt with. Dole was behind him. One other man. She stood aside. Pritchard came in. He looked at the room. The cot. The chest. The window with the curtains she'd been mending, still draped across the sill. He looked at her. He said, "Sit down, please." She did not sit down. He sat down on the single chair, the one she used for sewing, which he did without asking, which was the most natural thing in the world for a man who had spent 60 years sitting in whatever chair he wanted. She said, "I understand we've gotten off to a poor start." She said nothing. "I want to correct that," he said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions." She looked at him. "You sent men to my room at 2 in the morning, she said. "Yes," he said. "I did. That was an error in judgment. On my part." He said it. The way powerful men say things that are technically true but carry none of the meaning of the words they're using. "I apologize." She kept looking at him. He said, "I want to talk about the land, all right. You have a document," he said, "a deed. Your father registered it in 1871. I understand. The document is currently with a lawyer." He did not look concerned about this. He looked as if it were simply a fact he was accounting for, the way you account for weather. "I also have documents. A prospecting claim filed in 1876 on the same parcel. A void claim," she said, "filed against a registered title." He paused. "That's one interpretation," he said. "It's the federal land law's interpretation." "The federal land law," he said carefully, "depends on the validity of the underlying title. If there are questions about the registration." "There are no questions," she said. The certifying agent was removed from his position for administrative irregularities, Pritchard said, in 1874. "I have documentation of that. If the certification was made by a compromised official, he was removed because he refused to cooperate with your operation," she said. "Not because of irregularities." He looked at her. For the first time, something moved behind those controlled blue eyes. "You know a great deal," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've had time." He was quiet. She said, "Mr. Pritchard, I want to be clear about something." He waited. "I understand that you're going to try to contest the deed," she said. "I understand you have people in the Las Cruces Bureau and that you've spent 2 years preparing a case against the certification. I understand that you have more money and more connections in the territorial legal system than I do, and that in a normal situation, those advantages would be decisive." He was very still. But there's going to be a federal official here, she said. An inspector general, who is going to look at every document, yours and mine, and who is not in your network and cannot be put in your network before he arrives. And when he looks at what you've prepared against the certification, he's going to see what it is. Long pause. You contacted Reed, he said. She didn't confirm or deny it. When, he said. She looked at him. When it was necessary, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up. He said, "You're Patrick Birdthorne's daughter." Yes, he was. He paused. A difficult man to deal with. He was an honest man, she said. Same thing, Pritchard said. In my experience. He walked to the door. He stopped. He didn't turn around. He said, "I've owned this town for 20 years, Miss Birdthorne. I've made it work. The roads, the water, the bank that keeps this place alive when the weather goes bad, or the market for cattle drops. I did that, and what I did with the understanding that in this territory, at this time, the man who builds things gets to benefit from what he builds." She said, "Even if what he builds is on someone else's land." He was quiet. "The world runs on a certain kind of order," he said, "and the order requires adjustments. When things don't fit, they have to be made to fit. My grandfather lived on that land for 30 years, she said. Yes, he said, he did. My father spent 10 years making sure I'd have a legal right to it. Yes, he said, he did. And you had him killed." The room was very quiet. He did not turn around. He did not confirm it. He did not deny it either. He stood at the door for one long, final moment. Then he walked out. Dole and the other man followed. She stood in the empty room. The curtains on the windowsill, the cot, the chest. She had just said it out loud. For the first time. To his face. He had not denied it. She sat down on the cot. Her hands were shaking again. She let them. Monday came. She was at the telegraph office at 7:30. Mast saw her coming through the window and had the door open before she knocked. She stepped inside. He said, "Response from Santa Fe. Came in last night." He handed her the paper. She read it. It was short. Reed was terse in the way that officials with actual authority are terse because they don't need to use extra words to establish that they're serious. "Miss Birdthorne. Received your message. Situation as described constitutes federal priority matter under Land Office, Act 1870 and Territorial Charter. Will arrive Harlan's Crossing Thursday with marshal escort. Do not surrender any documentation. Do not enter into any legal agreement before our arrival. C.W. Reed, Inspector General, Dep. Interior." Thursday, 4 days from her initial message. 3 days from now. She folded the paper. She said, "Mr. Mast, I need to ask you something." He said, "All right." She said, "Reed is coming Thursday. When Pritchard finds out, and he'll find out, probably before Thursday, he's going to move. Hard. Before the federal presence takes over." She looked at Mast. "I need to know that the records of my message and his response are protected." Mast looked at her. "I can lock the logbook," he said. "Federal seal. Under company protocols, no one can compel access to a sealed telegraph log without a federal warrant." "Do it," she said. He nodded. She said, "And Mr. Mast, thank you." He looked slightly surprised, as if being thanked was an unexpected development. "Your father," he said suddenly. "Patrick Birdthorne. He came through this office once. On his way to the mountains. He stopped to send a message. He paused. He said, 'I remember this,' he said to me. 'Young man, the most important work in any territory is the work that connects people to each other. Don't let anyone make you forget that.' And he paid me $1 for the message, which was twice what it cost, and he said, 'The extra is for remembering.'" She looked at him. She said, "When was this?" 1873, Mast said. "October." "About a year before he—" He stopped. She nodded. She walked out. October of 1873. A year before he died. He had known. He had been here, passing through on his way to the mountains, and he had said that to a telegraph clerk and paid him $1 to remember it. And 5 years had passed, and Mast had remembered. And here she was. She walked into the October wind, and she thought, he was everywhere. He prepared everything. He left people in his wake like markers, like breadcrumbs. He had made her a path. She just had to walk it. She went to Grawl. She let herself into the storage space at the base of the water tower and found him awake, sitting on the cot with his Winchester across his knees, looking at nothing in particular with the patient, conserved stillness of a man accustomed to waiting. He looked up when she came in. She said, "Reed is coming Thursday." He was still for a moment. "That's fast," he said. Yes, he moved quickly, he did. Something in Grawl's expression shifted. "I know Reed." Slightly. He seemed to search for the word. Rigorous. He's the kind of man who takes the federal land laws literally. Which is why the mining consortiums don't like him. Which is why Pritchard doesn't own him, she said. Right. Grawl was thinking. She could see it. Pritchard is going to know before Thursday. He has people on the northern road if Reed sends advance notice, which he will. Standard procedure. He'll know by tomorrow, she said. At the latest. Which gives him 2 days. Yes. Grawl was quiet. She said, "I told him yesterday." Pritchard. To his face. That I'd contacted a federal official. He looked at her sharply. He stopped. Why? Because he came to my room, she said, and because I wanted him to know that the situation had changed, that it was no longer something he could resolve quietly. He's going to accelerate. Yes, she said. He's going to feel the window closing and he's going to move, which means the next 2 days are the most dangerous. Yes. He was looking at her with something more focused than what had been there before. You told him to his face, he said, that you'd contacted federal authorities. Yes. In front of Dole. Yes. Knowing it would accelerate. Knowing it had to happen at some point, she said, and better in a controlled way than not. He shook his head slowly. He stopped. What? Deliberate, he said. You're extraordinarily deliberate. She thought about sitting on the cot the night she'd opened the envelope, choosing to move and what to move and when. The patience of 7 years being converted into something operational. I had a good example, she said. Simply, that no more. Monday afternoon. She was wrong about Pritchard taking until tomorrow. He moved that evening. She heard it from Shear, who found her on the main street at 4 o'clock and fell into step beside her for exactly 1 block, speaking quietly and not looking at her. He said, he's preparing an injunction against the deed. He's filed paperwork in the territorial court. In Albuquerque, he has a judge there, Holloway, who's cooperative. The injunction, if granted, would freeze any action on the Birdthorn parcel, pending a determination of the certifications dispute. She kept walking. When, she said, he sent the papers this morning. By rider. Holloway could grant it by tomorrow evening, she thought. An injunction from a territorial court would not stop Reed. Reed was federal. Federal authority superseded territorial in land matters under the 1870 Act. But an injunction would create legal confusion, would create the appearance of an ongoing dispute that might, in some circumstances, slow Reed's ability to act decisively. It was a delaying tactic. It didn't change the outcome. It extended the timeline. And extending the timeline was dangerous, because extending the timeline gave Pritchard more time to do something that had nothing to do with courts. She said, "Is there anything in federal law that would preempt a territorial injunction in a federal land matter?" Shear was quiet for a moment. "Fitch would know," he said. She said, "Tell Fitch." Shear was quiet. She said, "Mr. Shear, tell Fitch." He peeled away from her without a word. She kept walking. She thought, 2 more days. She thought, just 2 more days. Fitch came to her room that evening. He knocked, his knock, 2 quick and 1 slow. She let him in. He said, Federal Land Act 1870, Section 14. Any territorial court action involving a parcel under federal title registration is automatically subordinate to federal jurisdiction upon request of a federal official. He sat down. If Reed makes the formal request when he arrives, the territorial injunction becomes moot. But until he arrives, she said. Until he arrives, technically, the injunction could be used to. He stopped. To justify physical intervention. If Pritchard's people wanted to argue that the deed itself should be surrendered pending the resolution, he'd use it to take the deed, she said. It would give him a legal color, Fitch said. Technically not legitimate, but enough color that in the short term, she said, where is the deed right now? He touched his vest pocket. In my office, he said. In the drawer, she thought, she said. Move it. He looked at her. Move it tonight, she said. Somewhere in your office that isn't the locked drawer. Because the locked drawer is where he'll look first when he has a colorable legal argument for searching your premises. Fitch stood up. I have a false bottom in my filing cabinet, he said, from when I was in practice in Kansas City. Old habit. He paused. I've never used it. Use it now, she said. He went out. She sat in her room. She thought, One day, and Reed arrives and it changes. She thought. Hold, she thought. Just hold. Tuesday. She was at the water tower before dawn. Grawl was up. He'd barely slept, she could tell from his face, but she didn't comment on it because he would not want her to. She said, "He's filed an injunction in Albuquerque. Territorial court. He'll use it as cover to move on the deed." Grawl said, "And the deed is safe," she said. "Different location." Fitch moved it. "Fitch," Grawl said. "He has a false bottom in his filing cabinet," she said. Grawl looked at her. "His own idea," she said. "Right." He was thinking. "The injunction is a problem. It's a temporary one," she said. "Reed preempts it automatically when he arrives. Tomorrow. Tomorrow." He looked at the ceiling of the storage room. "Pritchard is going to make a move today," he said. "He has to. He knows Reed is coming. He's going to try to get the deed, or the copy, or both before Reed arrives and the window closes. Yes. He's going to come at you directly," he said. "Not Dole this time. Himself, with the injunction as cover." She had thought about this. He could try to argue that the injunction gives him the right to take possession. "It doesn't legally," Grawl said, "but it gives him enough paper to make a scene, to create a public situation where he's acting under color of law, where resisting him looks like resisting the court." She looked at him, she said, "Then I need witnesses." She spent Tuesday morning doing 3 things. First, she went to every business on the main street, the general store, the hotel, the land records office, the stage line, and she told each proprietor, directly and without preamble, that there was a federal official arriving tomorrow, that she held a federal land deed that she had every right to hold, and that if anything happened to her in the next 24 hours, she wanted them to be aware of what was happening and why. This was not a small thing. She was making herself visible, loudly, actively, deliberately visible. 7 years of invisible, dismantled in one Tuesday morning of walking through Harlan's Crossing and saying, directly to one person at a time, "I exist. I am here. I am in this town, and something is happening, and I am telling you about it." Some of them were uncomfortable. One of them asked her to leave his shop. Most of them listened. She could see them thinking. Could see the calculation: Pritchard versus federal authority. Pritchard versus the risk of being publicly on record as ignoring a federally involved situation. Could see them beginning to weigh things they had not previously had occasion to weigh. Second, she went to find Wallace Crew. There was no local paper in Harlan's Crossing, but the Tombstone Epitaph out of Arizona was read here, and more importantly, its correspondent for the New Mexico Territory, a man named Wallace Crew, passed through Harlan's Crossing once a month, and was, at this time, in residence at the hotel. She had known this. She had been saving it. She found Crew at breakfast. She sat across from him. She told him everything. The deed, the certification, Pritchard's claim, the injunction, the federal inspector coming tomorrow. He took notes. She said, "I want it known. I want there to be a record. In writing. In a paper." He said, "This'll make Pritchard very unhappy." "Yes," she said, "he advertises in the epitaph." She looked at him. He kept taking notes. Third, she went to the church. Not to pray. To find Father Ignacio, who was the one person in Harlan's Crossing who had a duty of neutrality that even Pritchard had always respected, because Pritchard needed the church's social infrastructure and the church's implicit endorsement of the order of things, and he could not afford to be publicly at odds with it. She told Father Ignacio what was happening. He listened. He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I need you to be available. Tomorrow, if things become public, I need a neutral witness." He looked at her steadily. "Your father," he said, "came to confession here once." She was surprised. Her father had not been Catholic. "He wasn't Catholic," the priest said. "I told him that. He said he knew. He said he didn't need absolution. He said he just needed to say something out loud to someone he trusted, not to repeat it. And would I be willing?" "Was he?" she said. "Yes." Father Ignacio folded his hands. "He told me about the deed, about what he'd done and why. He asked me to." He paused. "He asked me to remember that a young woman might someday need to establish that her father was an honest man, and to say so if I was asked." The third person. The third marker her father had left. Fitch, masked. Father Ignacio. He had seeded the whole town, years before it mattered. Patient and deliberate and precise, like everything he did. She said, "Will you be available tomorrow?" Father Ignacio said, "I will be where I'm needed. Tuesday evening." She went back to the water tower. She let herself in. Grawl looked up from the cot. She sat down. She said, I spent the day making myself visible. He raised an eyebrow. She described what she'd done. The businesses. Crew. Father Ignacio. He was quiet for a moment. Then you built witnesses. Yes. Publicly. So that whatever Pritchard does tomorrow, there are people who were told beforehand what was happening. Yes. He looked at the Colt in his hands. He said, Your father told me something once. When we were working on the survey, he said, Dev, the only thing that keeps a powerful man from doing whatever he wants is other people knowing what he's doing. Power operates in the dark. Drag it into the light, and it has to behave. She sat with that. He was talking about you today, Grawl said. Everything you did today. He would have been very proud. He paused. Not surprised, but proud. She looked at the floor. She said, When this is over, yes? I want to go up there. To the land. I've never been up there. I've looked at it every day for 7 years, and I've never... She stopped. That's the first thing, Grawl said. When Reed is done. You go up. Will you come? He considered. If you want me there, he said. She looked at him. You're the one who certified it, she said. It seems right. He almost smiled. All right, he said. Then yes. Wednesday. The day Reed was coming. She was up before 4. She lay on the cot for a moment. In the dark, aware of everything. The town outside. The wind from the mountains. The weight of the Remington on the floor beside her. The quality of this day, this particular day, that she had been building toward for 2 years of watching and 7 years of waiting. And her whole life. If you counted it from the day her father took her to the survey office, and she sat in the corner and read every document on the desk, her whole life, this day. She got up. She dressed. She did not check the chest. There was nothing in the chest now, just the lock which was hers. She went out into the dark. The wind was very cold. The Manzanos were there. To the east, she could feel them, before the sky got light enough to see them, the way you always feel a large, ancient thing before you can look at it. 480 acres up there, her grandfather's ground, her father's life's work, hers. She stood in the street, facing east, in the dark, and she waited for dawn. She was 25 years old, and she was afraid, and she was ready both, at the same time, which was exactly what her father had made her for. The mountains turned amber with the light, and somewhere on the northern road, still an hour out of Harlan's Crossing, Callum Reed was riding toward them, and Aldous Pritchard was awake in his bank, looking at his window, and Devereux Grawl was at the water tower, the Winchester ready, waiting for her signal, and the whole of Harlan's Crossing was waking up. The day had come. She walked toward it. Dawn came hard, no gentleness to it, no slow warming, just the dark. Then the dark breaking open at the eastern edge of the world, like something that had been held back under pressure and finally gave. The Manzanos caught the first light. 480 acres up there in that amber, in that stone. Wren stood on the main street of Harlan's Crossing and watched the mountains come back out of the night, and she thought, today, just that, today. Not a plan, not a strategy, not the next 3 moves calculated out like pieces on a board. Just the word, the specific weight of it. The day her father had been building toward when he filed that deed in 1871, when he spoke to Fitch in 1873, when he stopped at the telegraph office and paid Mast $1 and said, the most important work connects people to each other. He had been building toward this day, and he had not lived to see it, so she was going to see it for him. Both of them, at once. She went to Fitch first, 7 in the morning. His office was locked, but she knocked the way she had learned to knock 2 quick and 1 slow, and he opened it before she finished. He was already dressed. He had not, she could tell, slept particularly well. She said, the deed. He reached into the filing cabinet, the false bottom. He produced the oilskin package, intact, sealed, exactly as she had left it. She took it. She put it inside her dress, against her skin, where it had started, where it belonged, Fitch said. Reed's arrival, do you know when? This morning, she said. Maybe midday. He nodded. She said, I need you at the meeting, when it happens. Whatever form it takes. I need you there as my legal representative. He looked at her. I'm your lawyer, he said. Pro bono. Yes, she said. Come when? When I send for you, she said. Be ready. She went out. She went to the church. Father Ignacio was in the nave, doing whatever priests do in the early morning hours when no one is watching. She knocked on the open door. He turned. She said, "Today." He nodded once. He reached behind the altar and produced his coat and his hat. He put them on. He said, "I'll be near." She went out. She went north. The water tower at the edge of town, gray in the morning light, the tank massive and dark above the storage room where Grawl had been living for 4 days in the patient, compressed way of a man waiting for something he knew was coming. She knocked the pattern they had established. 3 slow, 2 fast. The door opened to her. He looked at her face. He said, Today. Today, she said. He had the Winchester in his left hand, and the Colt on his hip, and the look of someone who has been still for long enough that stillness has become a kind of readiness, compressed, coiled, not tense, but absolutely present. He said, "Read?" "Midday. Maybe before." "Pritchard?" "Already awake," she said. "I can feel it." He nodded. "Where do you want me?" he said. She had thought about this all of last night. Lying on the cot with the Remington and the sound of the wind and the mountains outside. And the clarity that comes at 2 in the morning, when everything irrelevant falls away. She said, "Main Street. Visible. I want Pritchard's people to see you." He raised an eyebrow. "I've been invisible for 7 years," she said. "I'm done with invisible. I want them to see all of us. Together. In the open. Before Reed arrives." He understood. She could see him understanding. Not hiding. Not skulking. Not waiting for Pritchard to make the next move and reacting. Standing. Present. Visible. All of them Rin, Grawl, Fitch, Ignacio, in the open, in the main street, in the morning light, with the deed against her skin and the Winchester in Grawl's hand, saying without words, "We are here. We are not afraid. We are not moving." Making Pritchard make the first move in public, where people could see, where Wallace Crew of the Epitaph had his notebook, where the whole town that she had spent Tuesday, visiting one proprietor at a time, one frank conversation at a time, was now watching. "All right," Growl said. He picked up his coat. He put on his hat. He walked out of the storage room into the morning and stood in the open for the first time in 4 days. And the wind came off the mountains and hit him, and he turned his face into it briefly, and then looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet," which was fair. 8 o'clock. The main street of Harlow Crossing. She walked it. Grawl walked beside her. Not touching. Not close. Just beside. The town was doing what towns do in the morning. Opening up. Moving the ordinary machinery of a day that was for most people just a Wednesday. The smell of breakfast fires. Horses at the rails in front of the saloon and the hotel. A freight wagon coming slow from the south. The teamster not looking up. But people noticed. She could feel it happening. The slight pause in motion when a shopkeeper looked out his window and saw them. The way 2 men talking on the corner stopped their conversation and watched. The texture of a town becoming aware of something. Because she had been here 7 years. Because they knew her face. They knew the laundry woman. The Indian girl. The one who kept her head down, and she was not keeping her head down. That was the thing. That was the thing that made them stop and look. She was walking down the middle of the main street of Harlan's Crossing at 8 in the morning with her back straight and her eyes forward, and the deed against her skin and a man with a Winchester walking beside her, and she was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid. She was very afraid. But she was doing it anyway, which was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Pritchard saw them from his window. She knew he did. She could feel his gaze on them from the second-floor office. The same gaze she had felt every morning for 7 years, that hunting animal quiet, that focused stillness. Except this morning she looked up, directly at the window, directly at him. She held it for 2 seconds. Then she looked forward again and kept walking. Let him think about that. Let him understand that the woman who had spent 7 years refusing to look up had decided that this was the day she was done with that particular discipline. Growl said quietly, not turning his head. "Second-floor window." "I know," she said. "He'll move soon." "Yes. Before Reed. That's what I'm counting on," she said. He glanced at her. She said, "If he moves before Reed, he moves in public. In front of the witnesses I spent Tuesday preparing. In front of Crew's notebook." She paused. "He's a careful man. A meticulous man. He spent 20 years building a reputation as the man who makes this town work. He does not want to be seen visibly, publicly, in front of witnesses, doing what he's been doing in dark lanes and locked chests. You're betting that his reputation matters more than the deed. I'm betting that it matters enough to constrain how he moves, she said. Not that it stops him, just that it limits his options. Grawl thought about this, he said. That's a fine line. Yes, she said. I know. 9 o'clock. Dole came out of the bank. He crossed the street toward them with the deliberate, measured walk of a man who has been told to do something and is doing it, and is not particularly happy about the situation he finds himself in. He stopped in front of them. He looked at Grawl, at the Winchester, at Wren. He said, Mr. Pritchard requests that Miss Birdthorne present herself at the bank. She said, no. He blinked, just that one blink. Then he recovered. There's a legal matter, he said. The territorial injunction is subordinate to federal jurisdiction in this matter, she said. Under Section 14 of the Federal Land Act of 1870, the appropriate federal official is arriving today. All legal matters can be addressed at that time. Dole stared at her. Where did she get that? She could see him thinking it. She said, tell Mr. Pritchard that if he wishes to present his documentation, he can do so when Inspector General Reed arrives, in a proper proceeding, with all parties present. Dole looked at Grawl. Grawl said nothing, just stood, with the Winchester. Dole looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he turned and went back to the bank. Grawl said quietly, how'd it feel? She thought about it. Like something that needed to happen, she said. For a long time. 10 o'clock. Wallace Crew of the Epitaph found her at the edge of the street, notebook already out. He said, he's going to come out himself. She looked at him. He said, I've been in this territory 11 years. I've seen Aldous Pritchard operate. When Dole comes back without what he went for, Pritchard comes himself. He paused. He'll bring the injunction paperwork. He'll try to make it look like a legal process. He'll want me to write it that way, she said. Then don't write it that way. He looked at her. What do you want me to write? He said. The truth, she said. That a woman with a valid federal land deed stood in the main street of Harlan's Crossing, and a man with 20 years of power and a void prospecting claim tried to take it from her. She held his gaze. Write that. Crew looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in the notebook. She didn't ask what. She trusted it. 10:30. Pritchard came out of the bank. He was dressed the way he always dressed, precisely, completely, the suit, the particular shade of authority that expensive clothing carries in a frontier town, the pocket square exact, the watch chain visible. He had 2 men with him, not Dole, 2 men she didn't recognize, which meant they were not from Harlan's Crossing, brought in from outside. Recent arrivals. She registered this without showing that she registered it. He walked across the street. He had a document in his hand. He stopped in front of her. He looked at Grawl, at the Winchester, at Wren. He said, Miss Birdthorne, I have a court order from the Territorial Court of New Mexico, 3rd District, ordering the preservation and surrender of the Birdthorne land deed, pending resolution of a certification dispute. You are legally required. No, she said. He stopped. You're legally required, he said again, louder. I heard you the first time, she said. The answer is no. Section 14. The Federal Land Act does not apply to an active territorial court proceeding. It applies, she said, to any territorial action involving a parcel under federal title registration. Your parcel is under federal title registration. The certification was made by a federal official. The registration is in the federal record. This is a federal matter. He looked at her. She looked at him. Around them, the street, not empty anymore. People on the boardwalk. The hotel proprietor in his doorway. 2 merchants she'd spoken to on Tuesday. Father Ignacio 20 yards away, standing perfectly still. Fitch, on the other side of the street, coat and hat. Crew, notebook open. And other people. People she hadn't coordinated with. People who had just come out. Because they could feel something in the air. Because towns, whatever else they are, have a nervous system. And the nervous system of Harlan's Crossing had been receiving signals all morning. Pritchard saw all of this. She watched him see it. Watched him take the inventory. The witnesses. The notebook. The lawyer. The priest. The Winchester. The girl. The girl who had spent 7 years being invisible. And was no longer. He said very quietly, so that only she and Grawl could hear. You have no idea what you're doing, she said, just as quietly. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm doing what my father spent 10 years preparing me to do. Something moved in his face. Quick. Almost invisible. But she was watching. He was a good man, Pritchard said. You had him killed, she said. Not quietly. Loud enough. Loud enough that Crue's pen stopped moving for a second. Loud enough that the two merchants on the boardwalk looked at each other. Pritchard's jaw tightened. He said, That is an unfounded. I know what it is, she said. And now other people know I've said it. In public. In this street. She held his gaze. That's the point. The standoff held for exactly 7 minutes. She counted. Pritchard standing with his court document. Her standing with her back straight and the deed against her skin and the Remington under her coat. Grawl and the Winchester. The town watching. 7 minutes of nobody moving. And then the sound came from the north. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Coming fast. Everybody heard it. Everybody turned. 3 riders came down the north road into Harlan's Crossing. At a pace that said urgency but not emergency. A controlled arrival. Deliberate. The lead rider was a compact man in his 50s. Gray suit, travel-worn. A badge on his chest that caught the October light. He sat his horse with the easy authority of someone who had been making this kind of arrival in territorial towns for 20 years and had learned exactly how to make it count without making it theatrical. He reined up in the middle of the main street. He looked at the assembly. He looked at Pritchard with his court document. He looked at Wren. He said, I'm looking for Wren Birdthorne. She stepped forward. She said, That's me. He looked at her for a moment. He said, Callum Reed, Inspector General, Department of the Interior. She said, You're early. He said, I rode through the night. A beat. Your message was persuasive. He dismounted. He looked at Pritchard. He said, Aldous. Pritchard, not a question. Pritchard looked at the badge. He looked at the document in his hand. He said, Inspector Reed, I have a territorial court order. I see it, Reed said. We'll address it. He looked around at the street, at the people watching, at Crew and his notebook, at Father Ignacio and Fitch, at Grawl. I'd like to conduct this in a proper setting. The Land Records Office, perhaps. Or the courthouse. The courthouse, Fitch said from across the street. As Miss Birdthorne's legal counsel, I'd fine, Reed said, an hour. I need to stable my horses and review documentation. He looked at Wren. Miss Birdthorne. Will you be present? Yes, she said. He nodded. He looked at Pritchard one more time. Then he walked his horse toward the livery. And just like that, the morning changed. She had thought afterward. She admitted this to herself. She had thought that the proceeding would be dramatic, that there would be confrontation, raised voices, some final moment where the truth landed like a blow. That was not what happened. What happened was slower and less satisfying in the immediate sense, and more satisfying in the real sense, which is how most important things actually go. They met in the courthouse. The church doubled as the courthouse, and Father Ignacio, who was neither a formal judge nor a sworn official, but who was the closest thing to neutral authority in Harlan's Crossing, presided in the loose, territorial fashion of someone who understood that at this moment the proceeding needed a fair witness more than it needed legal precision. Reed sat at the front, Wren across from him with Fitch beside her, Pritchard on the other side, with his 2 outside men, and a document case that contained whatever he had spent 2 years building in the Las Cruces Bureau records. Grawl stood against the back wall, Winchester on the floor beside him, Crew in the back corner with his notebook. Reed said, We are going to address 3 things: the federal land deed, the prospecting claim, and the certification dispute. He looked at both sides. In that order, Miss Birdthorne. She reached inside her dress. She produced the oilskin package. She unwrapped it. She placed the original deed on the table in front of Reed, and the certified copy beside it. Reed looked at both. He looked at them for a long time. He said, This is registration number 4471B, filed September 1871, Las Cruces Land Bureau. I confirmed the existence of this registration in the Federal Archive before I left Santa Fe. He looked up at Pritchard. It's real, Pritchard said. The certifying official was removed for cause, Reed said. I know. I pulled those records too. He looked at Grawl. Mr. Grawl, you certified this deed in September 1871? Grawl stepped forward. He said, Yes. Under proper authority? Yes. At the time of certification, were you acting within your mandate as a duly appointed Federal Land Bureau agent? Yes. The removal action against you in 1874. Reed looked at his documents, cites administrative irregularities. What were they? Growl said, I refused to reclassify registered parcels as unclaimed on behalf of private mining interests. That was the irregularity. Reed said, who requested the reclassification? Growl looked at Pritchard. Pritchard looked at the table. Growl said, representatives of the Pritchard Mining Company, acting through a land broker in El Paso. Reed wrote something, he said. The removal action is, therefore. He chose the word carefully. Suspect, Fitch said. It constitutes grounds for restoring the certification's validity in full, sir. Under the whistleblower provisions of the... I know the provisions, Reed said. Thank you, counselor. He looked at Pritchard. He said, the prospecting claim of 1876. Pritchard opened his document case. He produced his paperwork. He said, filed under unclaimed parcel status. At the time of filing, no registered holder had been in contact with the Bureau for 5 years. Under Section 7, Reed said, an unclaimed status cannot be imposed on a registered federal title without formal notice to the registered holder. Was notice sent to Miss Birdthorne? Pritchard was quiet. The holder was of unknown address, one of his men said. Reed looked at him. Then at Wren. He said, Miss Birdthorne, were you in Harlan's Crossing in 1876 when this prospecting claim was filed? Yes, she said. I had been in Harlan's Crossing for 3 years. Reed looked at Pritchard. Long pause. The claim, Reed said, is void. He said it the way a man says something that has already been true and is now simply being said out loud for the record. The federal deed stands. The certified copy stands. The registration stands. He looked at his documents again. The prospecting claim filed without proper notice to a traceable registered holder is not valid under federal land law and has no standing. He wrote, I am forwarding this finding to the Secretary of the Interior and the Attorney General of New Mexico Territory. The parcel registered as 4,471B, Manzano Mountains, New Mexico Territory, is the legal property of Wren Birdthorne, heir to the registered holder. The room was quiet. Fitch's pen was moving. Crew's pen was moving. Pritchard was looking at the table. Reed said, additionally, he looked up. I am opening an investigation into the 1,874 removal of Agent Growl and the filing of the 1,876 prospecting claim. Both may constitute federal offenses. Mr. Pritchard, you'll be receiving formal correspondence from my office. Pritchard looked up. He and Reed looked at each other for a long moment. Then Pritchard stood. He picked up his document case. He said nothing. He walked out. The 2 men with him followed. The door closed. The room breathed. She sat in the courthouse after everyone else had moved, and she held the deed in her hands, the original, the oilskin wrapped loose around it, and she looked at her father's name, Patrick Birdthorne, in the registered holder field. His name, and then a comma, and then the words and heirs. And heirs. He had known. He had always known. She pressed the deed against her chest, and she let herself have one moment, one real unguarded moment of talking to him. Not out loud. Not the way people talk to graves. Just the internal version. The one that sounds like thinking but isn't. I held the line. I didn't sign, I brought the court here. I'm sorry it took 7 years. She heard in the silence of her own mind the sound of him tapping his thumbnail against his front teeth. The sound of arriving at something. One more thing. She had known it was coming. Had felt it like weather since Tuesday morning when she was building her witness list, and her father's markers were showing themselves one by one, Fitch and Mast and Ignacio, and she was thinking, this is what he left. This is the path he made. And there was one she hadn't found yet. One she had been expecting without knowing she was expecting it. It came at 3 in the afternoon. A knock at her door. Not the 2 quick ones slow of Fitch. Not Grawl's pattern. Single knock. She opened it. Casper Dole. No Pritchard behind him. No second man. Just Dole alone. Hat in his hand. Looking for the first time since she'd known him, like something other than a man doing a job. She looked at him. He said, "May I come in?" She stepped aside. He came in. He stood in the middle of her room, the same room he'd come to in the dark at 2 in the morning 4 days ago. And he looked at the floor. And then he looked at her. He said, "Your father, Patrick Birdthorne." She was very still, he said. He didn't fall off a horse. She had known. She had known for nearly 4 years, but knowing alone and having it said out loud by the man who, she said, "Were you there?" Long pause. A very long pause. He said, "Yes." She breathed. She kept her face still. She kept her hands at her sides. She kept everything in the exact place it had been before he knocked on her door, because if she moved anything, if she let any of it shift, she did not know what would happen. She said, "Did you?" "No," he said. "Not me, but I was there." He looked at the floor. "I was there and I didn't." He stopped. "I was 28 years old and I had been working for Pritchard for 3 years, and I believed that what he said was true, that your father was a problem, that he was making things difficult that needed to be smooth, that it was—" He stopped again. "That's not an explanation." "I know that's not an explanation." "No," she said. "I've been carrying it for nearly 4 years," he said. She looked at him. She said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because you stood in that street this morning and you said it out loud, that Pritchard had him killed." He looked up, and I watched every person on that street hear it, and I watched Pritchard's face. He paused, and I thought, if she can say it out loud after all this time, then I can. He stopped. She waited. He said, "I'll testify to Reed's investigation. Whatever I know, whatever I was part of." His jaw worked. "I know what that means for me. I know." She looked at him for a long time. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was not performing regret. He was standing in her room with his hat in his hands and his face showing years of something he had been carrying, and he was saying, "I'll carry it differently now." She said, "Go to Reed's office today. Before you change your mind." He put his hat on. He went to the door. He stopped. He said, "He was a good man, your father. Even then, even at the end. He was calm." He said. Dole's voice was not steady. He said, "You can tell Pritchard he's made a mistake. Things like this don't stay buried." Dole paused. He was right. He went out. She stood in the room, the empty room, the cot, the chest, the window with the October light. Things like this don't stay buried. He had said that. Standing at the end of his life, knowing, and still calm. She pressed her hand against her chest. She breathed. She said out loud, "To the room I know, Father. I know." They left for the mountains at 4. 2 horses from the livery Grawl's roan and a bay mare she'd rented twice before for supply runs. The livery owner charged her full price as usual, which she paid without comment, because this was not the day to negotiate livery fees. They rode east, out of Harlan's Crossing, past the last buildings, past the church, past the water tower, where Grawl had lived for 4 days in the storage room, past the edge of town and onto the open ground, the road turning to track, and the track turning to something less than track, just the natural path that the land suggested, the drainage lines and the ridge lines, and the way the ground rose toward the manzanos in long, patient grades. The October light was long and amber. It hit the rock faces of the mountains and turned them something between gold and copper, the kind of light that exists only in late afternoon in the high desert, when the air is clean from the wind and the sun is low enough to be horizontal, and everything it touches becomes itself more intensely. She rode with her eyes on the mountains, not thinking, not planning. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was not thinking about what came next. She was just here, riding toward the land. Grawl rode beside her, not talking. He understood this. He had that quality, the ability to be present, without requiring anything from the presence. Some men filled silence with noise because silence made them anxious. He sat in it the way he sat in the storage room, patient, real. An hour up. The ground was different here. The scrub juniper denser, the rock showing through the thin soil in long tilted bands, the temperature falling slightly with the altitude, just enough to sharpen the air, just enough to make each breath feel more like something. She stopped. She didn't plan to. The horse just slowed, and she let it, and she looked around. The manzanos did not look like mountains from here. They looked like the land, the specific, particular land. The creek bed to the north, dry now in October but visible in the pale sand of its bed. The juniper growing dense along the eastern ridge. The rock outcroppings that her father had described in his survey notes. The tilted strata. The mineral color in the stone where the deposit lay deep and real and waiting. Grawl stopped beside her, she said. "He stood here." "Yes," Grawl said. "In 1870. when I was with him for the survey. He looked around. He stood about here and he looked at the strata and he said, Dev, there's something in this rock. I can feel it. And I said that geology didn't work by feeling, and he said, no, but fathers do. She looked at him. He said, he was talking about his father. Your grandfather, who had lived on this land for 30 years. He paused. He could feel his father's presence in the rock. He told me that. Straight-faced, like a surveyor telling you the elevation. Your father was a precise man. He was also, he believed in things, in the weight of land and who had stood on it and what that meant. She looked at the rock. She put her hand on it. The stone was still warm from the day's sun. Deep warm. The kind of warmth that goes all the way through. She thought about her grandfather. She had never met him. He had died before she was born, her mother's father, Mescalero Apache, who had lived on this land for 30 years and had asked his son-in-law to make it official, to put it in the papers, to give it the name that the other world required, so that it would be safe. It had not been safe. Nothing had been safe. But here she was, on the land, with her hand on the warm rock, and the deed in her dress, and the deed was hers. She sat on a flat stone above the creek bed as the sun went down. Grawl made a small fire. Practical. Just enough. He had brought food jerky and hardtack and dried fruit, the same Spartan provisions he'd been living on in the storage room, and they ate without much ceremony, because neither of them were people who required ceremony. The sky went from amber to orange to the dark violet of high desert dusk. The first stars appeared not one by one but all at once, the way they do in places with no lamplight to compete, as if they'd been there all along, waiting for the moment when the day got out of the way. She looked at them. She said, what happens now? To Pritchard. Grawl said, Reed's investigation, Dole's testimony. He stoked the fire once. The record's tampering in Las Cruces. If Aubrey Park's information confirms what we suspect, that's a federal charge. And the 1008-74 action against me, if Reed finds what I believe he'll find in the investigation. There was coordination. He paused. Pritchard built something very careful. But careful things leave evidence. You just have to look. He'll have lawyers, she said. The best, Grawl said. But even the best lawyers cannot make a void claim valid. She looked at the fire. She said, he had my father killed. Yes, Grawl said. Will that? She stopped. Will Dole's testimony be enough? Grawl was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said. Honestly. Territorial justice in 1878 is... He shook his head. It's imperfect. It's uneven. A powerful man with good lawyers can sometimes... He stopped. I won't promise you a thing I can't guarantee. She appreciated that. She hated it. She appreciated it. She said, then the land has to be enough. He looked at her. She said, I mean, even if the law doesn't reach him the way it should for what he did, the land is back. The truth is on record. Reed's investigation exists. Crew's article will run. She looked at the dark mountains. My father doesn't come back. But the thing he spent his whole life, protecting his father's land, is where it should be. She was quiet. That has to be enough, Grawl said quietly. Is it? She thought about it honestly. She said, I don't know yet. Ask me in a year. He nodded. She said, what about you? After this. He looked at the fire. Reed wants a written deposition, he said. I'll give it. That'll take a few weeks. And then? He was quiet. I don't know, he said. I haven't thought much past this. She looked at him. She said, stay. He looked up. She said, not I'm not. She stopped herself. The land needs a boundary survey. The original marks are 9 years old. And there's going to be interest from mining companies once the word gets out about the deposit. And I'm going to need someone who knows how those surveys work. Who knows the documentation. Who can make sure nobody. She stopped. Who can help me hold it? He looked at her for a long moment. She said, you put your name on that deed in 1871. It's your name on it too. You should be here when. She paused. When it becomes what it's going to become. He was quiet. The fire crackled. The stars were very bright now. He said, I'm not a young man. She said, neither was my father when he did the best work of his life. He almost laughed. Actually, almost. She had never seen that from him before. He said, all right. She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. The mountains around them dark and enormous and real. She said, he told me something once. My father. We were outside the survey office, and I was 12, and I had just read all his documents and asked about the boundary markers. And he looked at me the way you said. He looked at you in the survey office, like he was supposed to see something. Yes. She paused. He said, Ren, this land is going to ask something of you someday. I don't know exactly what, but when it does, I want you to remember the asking is not a burden. It's an inheritance. The land doesn't ask things of you because it needs help. It asks because it's deciding whether you're worthy of it. She was quiet. I was 12. I didn't know what that meant, Growl said, and now? She looked east, at the mountains, at the stone she could feel even in the dark, the warmth of it, the depth of it. The thing underneath that her grandfather had known was there, and that her father had documented, and that Pritchard had tried to take, and that the federal seal of the United States Department of the Interior had declared, as of this afternoon, was hers. She said, I think it was asking the whole time. I just didn't know I was answering. She stayed up there that night. Grawl rolled in his blanket near the fire and slept the sleep of a man who had been waiting for 4 days in a storage room and had earned the rest of actual ground. She sat with her back against the warm rock. She did not sleep. She watched the stars wheel overhead, the way they have wheeled overhead over these mountains for longer than any name given to them. Apache, Spanish, American, New Mexican, territorial, federal, birdthorn, all the names, just temporary labels on something that required no name to exist. The land. Just the land. At some point in the deepest part of the night, she reached inside her dress and took out the deed. She held it in her hands in the dark. She could not read it, no light, just starlight, which was not enough for reading. But she knew what it said. She had it memorized. Every word. Registration number 4471B. 480 acres. Eastern boundary from the creek to the ridge. North to south, from the old Apache trail markers. Holder, Patrick Birdthorn and heirs. Certified by D.F. Grawl, agent. New Mexico Territory Land Bureau. September 1871. She pressed it against her chest. She breathed the cold mountain air. She thought, I'm here, Father. She thought, we made it. Not a victory, not a triumph, not the dramatic conclusion of a dramatic story, just the specific, real, quietly enormous fact of being here, on this ground, under these stars, with the deed in her hands and the case closed and the next thing waiting to be figured out. Because there was always a next thing. That was the other thing her father had taught her. Not in words, in the way he lived, in the way he had prepared and left markers and made legal filings and spoken to lawyers and telegraph clerks and priests and agents, all of it not because he thought it would all go smoothly, but because he understood that the next thing was always coming, and the only answer to it was to be ready, and to move, and to hold the line, and when you couldn't hold the line, to figure out the next thing. She was 25. She had the land. She had work to do. She was ready. Dawn came up over the eastern ridge, different from below. Up here, you didn't just see the light arrive. You were in it. The moment the sun broke the ridge, it was everywhere on the rock, on the juniper, on the pale sand of the dry creek bed, on the 2 horses tethered 30 yards away, who lifted their heads and turned toward the warmth. On her. She turned her face into it, just for one moment. Eyes closed, the warmth on her face like a hand. She thought, good morning. She thought, I'm here. She thought, the land is here. She opened her eyes. Grawl was awake, sitting up in his blanket, watching her with the expression she had seen on him, intermittently, since the beginning, that recognition. Not of who she was, of what she was. She had understood, finally, what it was. He was looking at her the way her father had looked at things he was glad were in the world. She said, we should go down. He said, yes. She said, there's work. He said, there's always work. She put the deed back inside her dress. She stood. She looked at the mountains one more time, at the rock and the juniper and the tilted strata and the mineral color in the stone that her father had felt in 1870 and that she could feel now, standing on it, the weight of it under her boots. 480 acres. Her grandfather's ground, her father's work, hers. She turned toward the horses. She mounted. She rode down from the mountain into the morning. Harlan's Crossing in October. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps unless someone needs to mark something. She rode back into it, with the deed against her skin, and Grawl beside her, and the sun at their backs. And the town was waking up, and the people were opening their shops, and feeding their horses, and doing the ordinary work of a Thursday, and some of them looked up when she rode in, and she looked back, directly, without looking away. She rode to the stable, handed the bay mare to the liveryman, paid him in full, and walked out into the street. The bank was open. She could see through the window that Bennett Shear was at his desk. He looked up, saw her, looked back down. She kept walking. Father Ignacio was sweeping the steps of the church. He looked up. He nodded once. She nodded back. She kept walking. Mast was in the telegraph office. Through the window, she could see him at his equipment, and when he looked up and saw her, he did something she had never seen him do before. He smiled. She kept walking to her room, the single room behind the dry goods store that she had lived in for 7 years. The cot, the chest, the window, the place of she had made herself invisible. She stood in the doorway. She looked at it. Then she went in. She sat on the cot. She took the deed out one more time. She read it. Registration number 4,471. 480 acres. She folded it. She put it in the chest. She locked it. She put the key around her neck. She had a deed. She had land. She had work to do, and she had time. For the first time in a very long time, she had time. She sat in the room that had been her fortress and her prison and her camouflage, and she breathed, and she looked out the window at the mountains, and she said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some things are complete without words. Some truths close quietly, without fanfare, without thunder. Just the door shutting at last. Just the silence after. Just the mountains still there, waiting for the next thing she was going to ask of them, or they of her, which was the same thing, which had always been the same thing. Reed left the next morning. Before noon, he was, as Grawl had said, rigorous, a man who had a list and worked through it, who did not linger in places once the work was done, who understood that his presence in a town was a resource to be deployed, and not a social occasion. He had, before leaving, sealed the telegraph log at Mast's office, had recorded Grawl's preliminary depositions 2 hours, everything in sequence, the certification of the deed and the request to reclassify, and the refusal and the subsequent removal, and all of it, in Reed's hand, signed by Grawl, witnessed by Fitch and Father Ignacio, had issued a formal federal preservation order on all of Pritchard's mining company documentation, which meant that nothing could be destroyed or transferred without federal authorization, had notified the territorial governor's office by telegraph. He had also, quietly, before he left, said something to Wren that she had not expected. He had said, "Your father filed a complaint with the Department of the Interior in October of 1873 about the pressure being applied to Land Bureau agents in the Las Cruces office to reclassify registered parcels. The complaint was received, logged, and filed. We found it in the archive when we pulled the records on your deed." She had looked at him. He made an official record, Reed said, a year before he died, of everything that was happening, of what he'd refused to do and why, of who had been applying the pressure. He paused. "It corroborates Grawl's testimony completely. It corroborates your deed completely. It is, as of this morning, part of the federal investigation file." She had looked at him for a long time. "He filed a complaint," she said. "Yes, in 1873. October," Reed said. "About a year before his death." She thought about Mast and the dollar bill, and the thing her father had said to a telegraph clerk on his way to the mountains. He had filed the complaint before he went to the mountains. He had known, going into the mountains, that he had already started a record, that if something happened to him, there would be something in the federal files, that the truth would be there, waiting, for whenever someone came looking. He had known. She did not cry. She was not, in general, a person who cried in front of people she did not know well, and Reed was a person she did not know well. But she felt in that moment the full weight of it, the full, complete 7 years' heavy weight of being loved by someone who was no longer there to be thanked for it. She felt it. She held it. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Reed nodded. He was not an effusive man. He was the kind of man who did the work and said what needed to be said and then got back on his horse, and she appreciated that completely. He got back on his horse. He rode north. and she stood in the street of Harlan's Crossing, with the deed against her skin and the October wind in her face, and she watched him go, and she thought, "Father, you filed a complaint." All that time. He had known exactly what he was doing, every piece of it. The deed in her name, the conversations with Fitch and Ignacio and the telegraph clerk, the complaint with the Department of the Interior. He had built a structure. He had built it knowing he might not be there to see it used. He had built it for her. She stood in the street for a long time, after Reed's dust had settled. Then she went back to work. There was always work. The Pritchard situation resolved the way most things resolve, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the slow, grinding, bureaucratic manner of federal investigations, which move with the inevitability of geology rather than the speed of weather. The investigation took 6 months. She heard about it in pieces, from Fitch mostly, who had a professional relationship with the proceedings as her counsel of record, and who told her, in their periodic meetings, what was relevant and what was not, in the measured way of a lawyer who has learned that his clients are better served by accuracy than by reassurance. The records tampering in Las Cruces was confirmed. Aubrey Park, the retired court clerk that Fitch had telegraphed, had found alterations, subtle ones, the kind that required expertise to detect, that had been introduced into the certification file at some point in the previous 2 years. The alterations were consistent with an attempt to make Grall's certification appear irregular. They were also consistent, according to the federal forensic examiner, with the work of a specific man in the current Las Cruces bureau staff who had worked there since 1875 and who had, when confronted with the evidence, provided a great deal of additional information in exchange for considerations regarding his own situation. The 1874 removal of Grall was formally declared improper. His certification authority was posthumously restored, which was the kind of thing that sounded like a bureaucratic formality and was actually quite significant because it meant that every certification he had made during his tenure was confirmed as valid, which put to rest any remaining question about the Birdthorn deed. Caspar Dole testified. He testified to what he had seen on the road between Las Cruces and Harlan's Crossing in the autumn of 1874. He testified to the specific instructions he had received and from whom and what he had understood those instructions to mean. He testified to what he had and had not done, with a specificity that Fitch later told Wren was the most precise and complete voluntary testimony he had heard in 15 years of practice. The Territorial Attorney General, after reviewing Dole's testimony and the federal evidence, filed charges. Aldous Pritchard was arrested on a Tuesday morning in February of 1879, 4 months after Reed's visit, by a federal marshal and 2 deputies who came from Santa Fe and who were present, along with a significant portion of Harlan's Crossing's population, when they walked into the bank at 9 o'clock in the morning and put the document in front of him. She was not there. She had decided not to be there, not because she didn't want to see it. She did. She had wanted to see it for 7 years. But because being there meant being a spectacle, and she was done with being looked at. She had chosen, very deliberately, to be somewhere else that Tuesday morning, somewhere that was hers, somewhere that no one would photograph or describe or write about in Crew's newspaper. She was on the land, the Manzano parcel, registration number 4471B. 480 acres of rock and juniper and dry creek bed, and the specific mineral color of stones that carries copper deep inside it, deep and real and vast in the way that real things are vast, that don't become less real, simply because no one has been allowed to name them yet. She was sitting on the flat stone above the creek bed, where she'd sat on that first night, when Grall had made the fire and they'd eaten jerky and she'd told him to stay. He had stayed. He was there now, 30 yards away, doing something with a survey instrument, a theodolite borrowed from a surveying company in Albuquerque that had taken 2 months to arrange, because the boundary markers needed to be re-established and documented before the mining companies started pressing their interest, which was going to happen soon. And when it happened, she needed to be positioned to deal with it from a position of complete legal clarity. She watched him work. He moved through the task with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, unhurried, precise, aware of each step, and its relationship to the next one. He had been here 3 weeks. He had set up a small camp at the edge of the parcel, a canvas shelter and a cook fire, the kind of minimal existence that suited him, that had the quality of someone who had learned to make themselves comfortable in whatever conditions were available, without requiring comfort to be a given. He had told her, one evening, a little about the 4 years between Las Cruces and Harlan's Crossing. Not much. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, or perhaps it was more accurate to say that he was a man who talked about things he had done or seen rather than how those things had made him feel, which was a distinction she recognized because she operated the same way. He had drifted, not aimlessly. He was not built for aimlessness, but without a fixed direction, which was its own kind of drift. He had worked for a time with a survey crew in Colorado, had done some work for the Federal Land Office in Kansas, civilian contracting, the kind of work that used his expertise without requiring him to hold a position or allegiance. Had spent a winter in Taos that he mentioned only briefly, and with an expression that suggested the winter in Taos was its own particular category of experience that would require more than a campfire conversation to address. He had been, she understood, a man without a purpose, not without competence, not without character, without purpose. And then he had heard about the Birdthorn deed in Albuquerque in September, and he had understood with the immediate clarity of someone recognizing a debt they have been carrying for a long time that this was the thing. This was where he was supposed to be. This was the purpose that had been waiting. He had told her this without self-consciousness, without the performance of significance that some men applied to their moments of revelation. Just a simple statement of fact. I heard about the deed, and I knew I had to come. She had believed him. Not because she was inclined to trust easily. She wasn't. But because the architecture of what he'd done was consistent with the statement, the research he'd done before arriving, the way he'd come to her door immediately rather than taking time to establish himself, the fact that he'd risked standing in a lane with 3 of Pritchard's men on his first night in Harlan's Crossing. A man performing duty looks different from a man who is actually doing it. He was doing it. She watched him adjust the theodolite. The October light, a year later almost to the day, was doing the same thing it had done when she'd first come up here. The same amber, the same warmth on the stone, the same quality of late afternoon light in the high desert that made everything look as if it were exactly itself, nothing more and nothing less. No shadows or illusions, just the pure factual beauty of a thing being what it is. She thought about Dole. He had been charged as well as an accessory for being present at a scene that was now officially classified as a criminal act. His testimony had earned him leniency. He would not, in all likelihood, serve a significant amount of time, if any. She did not know how she felt about that. Actually, she did know how she felt about it. She felt that the justice she had gotten was incomplete. She also felt that incomplete justice was better than none. And she felt that holding on to the incompleteness, letting it become the thing that defined the outcome, was a choice she was not going to make. Because the outcome was not Dole's fate or Pritchard's trial. The outcome was here, on this stone, under this sky. The outcome was registration number 4471B. The outcome was hers. Grawl finished his adjustment and looked up and saw her watching him and raised a hand, just a brief acknowledgement, not a wave. The gesture of 2 people who have established a working understanding and do not need to perform it. She raised a hand back. She looked at the mountains. She thought about her grandfather. She had found, in the months since Reed's visit, that she thought about him more than she had before. Not as an abstraction, the grandfather she had never met, the Apache man who had lived on this land and asked his Irish son-in-law to make it official, but as a specific person, with specific qualities that she was beginning to piece together from the fragments she had. Her mother had talked about him sometimes when Wren was young, not often. The way people talk about people they miss, which is in pieces. In specific moments, he said once, I remember when, he used to. You don't describe a whole person from loss. You describe moments, fragments, the specific texture of specific instances. Her grandfather had been a man who knew the names of all the plants on this mountain. That was one of the fragments. He had walked her mother through the land when she was a girl and named everything. Not the Spanish names, not the Anglo names, the Mescalero names, which were specific and often described the quality of the thing rather than classifying it. The way that naming systems that emerge from living closely with something tend to be more specific and more accurate than naming systems that arrive later and impose an external logic. He had known the names. The plants were still here. She didn't know the names. That was something she thought about. That there were things she had lost, things that had been in her family and were now lost to her, because of the accumulation of events and displacements and losses that constituted the specific history of people like her, people who were caught between worlds and fully claimed by neither, and that she would never get all of those things back. The language, mostly. The full depth of it. The names of the plants. The land was back. She was going to learn the names. Not all of them. Probably not all of them. But what she could learn, she would. Because the land was asking in the way her father had said it would ask, and the answer she was giving it was, I'm paying attention. I'm trying. I'm learning what there is to learn about you, about this place, about who has stood here before me and what they knew. That was the inheritance. Not just the acreage, not just the copper, the knowing, the paying attention. She put her hand on the rock. Still warm. Even in the shade, even this late in the afternoon. The stone held the heat of the day's sun, the way stone does, slow to warm, slow to cool, the long memory of something that absorbs rather than reflects. She thought, still warm. She thought, still here. She stood up. Growl had finished with the theodolite and was noting something in his survey book. She walked over to him. She said, how's it looking? He said, the eastern boundary markers are exactly where the original survey placed them. The creek line has shifted maybe 10 feet south, which is within normal for 9 years of seasonal flow. He was reading from his notes, precise and specific, not checking that she was following. He had learned in the weeks they'd been working up here that she followed. The northern markers are the ones I want to restake. The original pins are still there, but they're low. I want to replace them with something more visible, she said. More visible to mining company surveyors? He said. Yes. She said, do it. He said, already ordered the materials. She almost smiled. He had been doing that more lately, taking action before she confirmed it, because he knew what she was going to confirm, because they had been working long enough together that the territory of her priorities was something he understood without needing to ask. It was an efficient arrangement. It was also, she had noticed, something more than efficiency. She had not yet named what more than efficiency meant in this context. She was not, in general, a person who named things before she understood them clearly. And she was not yet sure she understood this clearly. She was not in a hurry. The land would tell her when the moment was right. She looked out over the parcel. 480 acres. Dusk was coming. The color of the mountains was changing. The amber going to gold. The gold beginning to shade toward the dark violet that preceded full dark up here. In Harlan's Crossing, Aldous Pritchard was in a cell. Or perhaps not yet. Perhaps he had made bail. Perhaps his lawyers had arranged something she did not know the details and had chosen not to follow them closely, because the details were not the point. The point was here. The point was this, she said. We should start back. He said yes. He packed the theodolite into its case with the care of someone putting a good tool away properly, which was to say, efficiently, specifically, without ceremony, but also without rushing, each piece in its place. She watched him. She thought about the first time she had seen him. Not the door, not the moment he knocked, which she had been prepared for, because she had been preparing for the possibility of someone connected to the deed arriving. For months, ever since she had noticed Pritchard's interest intensifying, which was to say, for about 2 years, she had been preparing for some version of this arrival. Not specifically a retired Land Bureau agent with a scar and a limp, but something. The moment she was thinking about was in the lane, when Dole and his men had been there, and the saloon door had opened, and he had been there. She had known in that instant, before she had had time to analyze anything, before she had run any of the calculations she was accustomed to running, she had known that he was not a threat, not because he was obviously safe. He wasn't obviously safe. He was a man with a colt on his hip and a scar, and the particular economy of movement that comes from having used a gun before in situations that required it. But she had known. It was the same kind of knowing that her father had talked about once in the context of something else entirely, the way that you could sometimes feel the truth of a thing before you had articulated the reasons for it. Not mysticism, not intuition in the vague, unverifiable sense. Just the rapid processing of accumulated information at a speed that preceded conscious analysis. She had accumulated a great deal of information about how people moved and what they intended. 7 years of watching. And in those 7 years, she had learned to read the gap between how someone moved and what they said, because what people said and how they moved were frequently different, and the movement was almost always more honest. Grawl had moved toward her in that lane, the way someone moves toward something they intend to protect, not perform, not demonstrate, actually protect. That was a specific quality of movement. She had recognized it. She picked up the survey bag. He took it from her without a word, just reached over and took it, because it was the heavier of the two bags and she'd been carrying the other for 3 hours, and they'd had this particular negotiation enough times that it no longer required words. They walked toward the horses. The sky was doing the thing it did up here in the evening, going very large. The haze of the valley was below them, and above was nothing but atmosphere, the actual depth of it, visible in a way it wasn't from the valley floor. The sky not a ceiling but a space, a genuine vertical space, going up and up and up until it became something else entirely. She looked at it, she thought. Father, she thought, do you see this? The wind off the high peaks, the stone warm under her feet. 480 acres. Hers. They rode down in the last of the light, and the town appeared below them as they descended, the lights coming on in the buildings, one by one, the specific pattern of Harlan's Crossing at dusk that she had observed from here and not from here, in imagination and in reality, and that looked now like what it was. A town she knew, a town that knew her, a town that had tried to make her invisible and had failed. She was not invisible. She was here. She was on the land. She was going back down to the town, and tomorrow she was coming back up, and the day after that, and the day after that, and every day she came back, she would learn something more about what this place was, and what it had been, and what it was going to be. And someday, she thought, someday she would know the names of all the plants. Her grandfather had known them. She would learn them. That was the promise she made to the stone and the sky and the long mountain wind. That was the promise she made to the girl her grandfather's granddaughter had been, and to the woman she was, and to whoever came after her. I'm paying attention. I'm here. I'm learning. She rode into Harlan's Crossing as the last light left the mountains, and the mountains went dark behind her, and the town received her the way it had always received her, without ceremony, without fanfare, the doors and windows of it glowing yellow warm in the evening dark, except that this time she rode in from the east, from the mountains, from the land, from the direction she had been looking for 7 years. She handed the horse to the liveryman. She paid him. She walked home. Her name was Wren Birdthorn. She was 25 years old. She was standing on her own ground, and she had work to do. Her name was Wren Birdthorn. She was 25 years old. She was still in Harlan's Crossing, but she was standing on different ground now. Her own. At last. Her own.